Good evening and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. There is a city buried beneath the soil of southern Italy that died in a single morning and has been speaking to us ever since. It was not a great capital, not an empire's throne, not a place where history was supposed to be made, and yet Pompeii became perhaps the most intimate window into the ancient world that has ever been opened to human eyes. Tonight we're going to walk its streets together, meet its people, watch it live, and watch it end, and somewhere along the way, I hope you find your way gently to sleep. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that join us for these late-night dives into history. Now dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The land before the city, Campania and the Oscan origins. Before there was Pompeii, before there were streets and forums and painted walls and bakeries and bars that never seemed to close, there was a landscape. And it is worth spending a moment with that landscape, because it explains almost everything that came after. Campania. The name itself carried a kind of promise. In Latin it means the land of fields, the flat country, and anyone who has ever stood on its coastal plain and looked out across the Bay of Naples toward the shimmering water and the distant islands and the green hills rolling back into the interior, will understand immediately why the ancient world considered this one of the most desirable places on Earth. The soil here was extraordinary. Farmers who worked the volcanic ground around the Bay of Naples found it almost unfairly productive. Grapes grew here in extraordinary abundance. Grain pushed up through the earth with minimal encouragement. Orchards of olive trees and fruit trees lined the hillsides, and the sea beyond the bay offered fish in such quantities that it almost seemed inexhaustible. This was the kind of land that people fought over. That fact is important, and we will return to it more than once tonight. But before we talk about the people who came here and settled and built and argued and loved and died, we need to talk about the thing that made this landscape what it was. The thing that sat at its northern edge like a patient giant, not particularly remarkable in appearance, not especially dramatic compared to some mountains, just a broad, gently sloped form rising above the plain, sometimes capped with cloud, sometimes perfectly clear against the blue Italian sky. Mount Vesuvius. We know what Vesuvius is. Everyone who has ever opened a history book knows what it did. But the people who first settled the plain at its feet, the people who planted their vineyards in its rich volcanic soil and built their first rough settlements in its shadow, they did not know. They could not have known. There had been no major eruption of Vesuvius in recorded memory by the time the Romans were walking its slopes in the 1st century CE. The mountain appeared dormant, inactive, just a mountain. A very fertile mountain, actually, whose lower slopes were covered in forests and vineyards and small farms. Strabo, the Greek geographer writing around the time of Augustus, noted that the summit of Vesuvius looked as though it had once contained fire, but that now the fires had gone out. He observed the black cindery appearance of the rock. He was in his way reading the evidence correctly. He just had no way of knowing that dormant is not the same as dead. The earliest people to call this landscape home were the Oscans. This is a name that does not appear in many popular histories, but it deserves our attention for a moment, because the Oscans are the baseline from which everything in this story grows. They were an Italic people, part of the broad family of cultures that occupied the Italian peninsula in the centuries before Rome came to dominate everything. They spoke Oscan, a language related to Latin but distinct from it. They farmed, they traded, they organized themselves into communities, and at some point, probably in the 6th century BCE, they settled at a particularly advantageous spot on the coastal plain south of Vesuvius. The location they chose was not accidental. A low lava plateau rose above the surrounding plain at the mouth of the river Sarnus. This plateau offered natural defensibility. It was elevated enough to see what was coming from any direction, close enough to the river to allow easy access to water and trade, and situated on a natural route between the coast and the interior of Campania. The Oscans did not build a great city here. They built a settlement, a collection of rough structures, perhaps a sanctuary, probably some form of communal gathering space, and the beginnings of the street pattern that would persist, remarkably, for centuries. What we know about this earliest Pompeii is limited, and comes almost entirely from archaeology rather than written records. The Oscans left us no literature, no inscriptions that survive in great quantities, no account of their own history. What they left us is buried deep beneath the later Roman city, accessible only in fragments through the most careful excavation. But what those fragments suggest is a community of people engaged in agriculture, in trade along the river and the coast, and in the kind of religious practice that seems to be one of the most universal human instincts. There were sanctuaries here from very early on, places where people gathered to make offerings and seek favour from powers larger than themselves. The landscape around this earlier settlement was dramatically different from what we might imagine today. The coastline of the Bay of Naples has shifted considerably over the centuries, partly because of the geological phenomenon known as bradycism, the slow rise and fall of the ground caused by volcanic activity beneath the surface. In the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, the sea was probably closer to Pompeii than it later became. The harbour at the mouth of the Sarnus was likely more accessible, more active, more central to the life of whatever community was beginning to take shape on that lava plateau. The rivers and streams of Campania in this period were bordered by dense vegetation, willows, poplars, rushes, the kind of lush riparian landscape that the Mediterranean can produce when water is available and the climate cooperates. Birds would have been everywhere along the river. Fishermen would have worked its lower reaches near the sea, and up on the plateau the earliest Pompeians would have looked out over a world of extraordinary richness and, though they could not know it, extraordinary danger. It is worth pausing here actually, because I think there is something genuinely moving about the Oscans in this story. They were not Romans, they were not Greeks. They were not the people whose names fill the history books. They were simply the first ones here, the ones who looked at this volcanic plain beside a mountain they did not fear and said, "This is where we will make our home." And in a sense they were right. It was a good home. For several centuries it would be an excellent home. The danger they could not see would not arrive for many hundreds of years. In human terms, that is long enough that it barely matters. In geological terms, it is the blink of an eye. The character of early Campania was shaped by more than just geography, though. The region sat at a crossroads of the ancient Mediterranean world, a meeting point between different peoples moving along the coasts and through the interior of the Italian peninsula. The Oscans were not alone here. They were surrounded by and in contact with Greeks to the south, who had been colonizing the coasts of southern Italy since at least the 8th century BCE. They were aware of the Etruscans to the north, that enigmatic civilization whose power had extended southward through Latium and into Campania at various points in the early centuries. They were in contact with other Italic peoples across the interior, the Samnites among them, who would eventually become the dominant power in this region. All of these interactions left traces, in the pottery styles of early Pompeii, in the gods that were worshipped at its earliest sanctuaries, in the basic layout of its streets. Pompeii was, from its very beginnings, a place shaped by the meeting of different cultures, and this quality, this absorptive, adaptive, multiculturally inflected quality, would remain characteristic of the city throughout its life. The volcanic soil that made Campania so productive also gave it a particular character. People who live in volcanic regions develop over time a different relationship with the earth than people who live in more geologically stable places. The ground here was warm in places. Springs of sulphurous water bubbled up in the coastal areas near what is now Pozzuoli. Earthquakes were not unknown. The earth was alive in ways that it was not in, say, the flat plains of northern Europe or the limestone uplands of Greece. The ancient inhabitants of Campania interpreted these phenomena through their religious understanding of the world. Volcanic springs were sacred. Underground chambers that breathed poisonous gas were the entrances to the underworld. The earth itself was a divine presence, unpredictable and requiring propitiation. There is something quietly poetic about the fact that the city we are going to spend tonight exploring was built on a lava flow from the very volcano that would eventually destroy it. The plateau on which Pompeii stood was made of solidified lava from an earlier prehistoric eruption of Vesuvius, one so ancient that no human memory of it survived. The city literally stood on the remains of a previous catastrophe, completely unaware of its significance. If that is not a metaphor for the human condition, I do not know what is. By the 5th century BCE, the settlement at the mouth of the Sarnus had grown into something more recognizable as a town. Streets were being laid out with some degree of intention. Sanctuaries were being built in stone rather than wood. The community was participating in the broader trade networks of the Mediterranean, importing Greek pottery, exporting the agricultural products of Campanian soil. The Oscans of Pompeii were becoming, slowly and without dramatic announcement, urban people. They were building a city. They did not call it Pompeii, most likely. The name as we know it comes through Latin, but its origins may well be Oscan. Some scholars believe it derives from an Oscan word related to the number 5, perhaps suggesting a federation of 5 villages. Others connect it to a word meaning a place of pump or springs. The etymology is uncertain, as so many ancient etymologies are. What is not uncertain is that by the time the wider world began to notice this spot on the Bay of Naples, it was already a place with character. It had already absorbed influences from the Greeks and the Etruscans. It had already developed its own religious traditions and its own way of organizing community life. It was not a blank slate waiting for civilization to arrive. It was a place that had been developing its own modest but real civilization for centuries. And Vesuvius stood above it all, covered in vines, green and serene and utterly, catastrophically, patiently silent. Greeks, Etruscans, and the Samnites, a city passed between peoples. One of the things that strikes you when you spend time with the archaeology and history of early Pompeii is just how many different hands shaped it before the Romans ever arrived. The city that was buried in 79 CE was recognizably Roman, in its language, its institutions, its architecture, and its culture, but it was built on layers, and each of those layers contributed something, left something, changed something that persisted even when the culture that had produced it had been replaced by another. The Greeks arrived in southern Italy early. The process of Greek colonization of the western Mediterranean began in earnest in the 8th century BCE, when Greek city-states, facing population pressure and internal political conflicts, began sending out groups of settlers to establish new communities along the shores of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Southern Italy and Sicily became so densely colonized by Greeks that the Romans later gave the whole region the name Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Cities like Cumae, Neapolis, Paestum, Rhegium, and dozens of others were founded by Greek settlers who brought with them their language, their gods, their artistic traditions, their agricultural practices, and their deeply ingrained habit of organizing life around the city-state. Neapolis, modern Naples, was founded probably in the 5th century BCE on the site of an earlier Greek settlement called Parthenope. It sat at the northern edge of the bay that would later bear its name. It was a proper Greek polis, organized along the lines of a Greek city with its assembly, its magistrates, its sacred precincts, and its lively commercial harbour. Neapolis was, from very early on, a sophisticated place. It maintained its Greek character with remarkable tenacity, even into the Roman period, when it had technically been absorbed into the Roman state. There were still Greek games held at Neapolis in the 1st century CE. Augustus himself loved the city and spent time there. He spoke Greek there, apparently with genuine pleasure. Pompeii was not a Greek colony. It was an Oscan settlement, but it was within the orbit of Greek cultural influence from a very early period. The pottery found in Pompeii's earliest layers is Greek, or at least Greek-influenced. The religious traditions of early Pompeii show clear Greek elements. The Temple of Apollo, which stands at the edge of the Forum in the city we excavate today, has origins that go back to the 6th century BCE, and its earliest form was built in a style that reflects Greek rather than purely Italic traditions. Apollo himself was a Greek god, adopted into the Italic world with remarkable enthusiasm. This cultural influence worked through trade and contact rather than conquest. The Greek cities of the Bay of Naples traded with the Oscan settlements of the interior, and in that trading relationship ideas as well as goods moved back and forth. A family in early Pompeii who bought Greek pottery was not necessarily becoming Greek, but they were entering into a cultural conversation with the Greek world, absorbing its aesthetic values, becoming familiar with its myths and gods and artistic conventions. The Etruscans present a different and more complicated story in the history of Campania. Etruscan civilization had flourished in what is now Tuscany and northern Lazio from at least the 9th century BCE, and at the height of their power in the 7th and 6th centuries, the Etruscans had extended their influence southward into Campania. There is evidence of Etruscan presence and influence at Pompeii, particularly in the 6th century BCE. Etruscan-style pottery and metalwork appear in the archaeological record. The layout of the earliest sanctuary area in Pompeii may reflect Etruscan urban planning principles. The Etruscans were, in many ways, the great cultural mediators of early Italy. They absorbed Greek influence enthusiastically and then transmitted it, transformed and filtered through their own sensibility, to the Italic peoples they came into contact with. In this way, Pompeii received Greek influence through 2 channels simultaneously, directly from the Greek cities on the coast and indirectly from the Etruscans to the north. The city was, from its earliest period, a place where cultural currents met and mingled, But the Etruscans' power in Campania did not last. By the end of the 5th century BCE, the Samnites were asserting themselves across the interior of southern Italy, and Campanian Etruscans were being displaced. The Samnites were a tough, highland Italic people, organised into tribal confederacies and deeply militaristic in their culture. They were, if we are being honest, exactly the kind of people you would not want arriving at your city gates with hostile intentions, because they had a great deal of experience in successfully taking things, and in 423 BCE they took Capua, the most important Etruscan city in Campania. And around the same time, or perhaps slightly later, Pompeii came into the Samnite sphere. The Samnite period in Pompeii is actually one of the most architecturally impressive phases in the city's history, which surprises people who think of the Samnites primarily as warriors. The Samnites of Campania, particularly in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, became extraordinarily prosperous. They benefited from their participation in trade throughout the Mediterranean world, from agriculture on the rich Campanian plain, and from their position along the trade routes between the Greek south and the growing power of Rome to the north. This prosperity funded building on a remarkable scale. The 2nd century BCE is when Pompeii began to look something like the city we excavate today. The street grid was formalised. The forum area was developed into a proper public space with monumental buildings. Temples were built or rebuilt in more durable materials. Large private houses, the atrium houses that became characteristic of Pompeian domestic architecture, were constructed by wealthy Samnite families. The House of the Faun, which we will visit later tonight in more detail, dates in its earliest phases to the 2nd century BCE. It is a Samnite house. Its floor plan, its scale, its ambition belong to the Samnite mercantile aristocracy of Campania at the height of its confidence and wealth. Walking through what we can reconstruct of Samnite Pompeii, you get a sense of a city that was genuinely flourishing. It was not a backwater. It was not a modest provincial settlement. It was a sophisticated urban centre with connections to the wider Mediterranean world, with an educated elite who commissioned fine art and expensive imported goods, and with the infrastructure of a real city. Streets were paved, water was managed, public spaces were maintained. The Samnites of Pompeii were, by any reasonable measure, civilized people living civilized lives. They also left us the language that allows us to read some of the oldest inscriptions at Pompeii. Oscan writing, the language of both the original settlers and the Samnite period, appears on walls and in public inscriptions at Pompeii. These inscriptions give us names, some of them, and occasionally a glimpse of public life, electoral notices, religious dedications, boundary markers. The Oscan alphabet looks somewhat similar to Latin, but is not identical. Reading it requires specialized knowledge. When it was first encountered by early modern scholars, it presented a genuine puzzle. Today we can read most of it, and what it tells us is that Pompeii before the Romans was a real and functioning community with its own administrative traditions and its own way of organizing civic life. The gods of Samnite Pompeii were a mixture. Apollo, as we noted, had a sanctuary here from very early on, but the Samnites also brought their own religious traditions. The goddess Mephitis was worshipped at a sanctuary near the city, a deity of sulphurous springs, which makes a certain amount of ominous sense in this volcanic landscape. Various Italic gods and heroes received veneration, and the influence of the Greek world meant that the Olympian gods were familiar and present even in this non-Greek city. The Samnite period came to an end not through a sudden conquest, but through a gradual and complex process of political change that we call the Social War, and that story deserves its own chapter because it marks one of the most significant transitions in Pompeii's history. The arrival of Rome did not merely add a new layer to the city, it fundamentally remade it. The Pompeii that emerges from the Social War is recognisably the Pompeii of the famous eruption, at least in its basic political and institutional character. Everything that came before was preparation. What came after was the city we know. But before we move there, let us take a moment to appreciate the layers. The Oscans who first settled the lava plateau, the Greeks whose cultural influence filtered in through trade and proximity, the Etruscans who brought their own synthesis of Greek and Italic traditions, the Samnites who built the city's physical infrastructure and made it genuinely prosperous. Each of these peoples contributed to what Pompeii eventually became. When the Romans walked in, they did not find a blank canvas. They found a city with centuries of history, a city that had already been shaped by the meeting of multiple cultures, a city with its own identity, its own gods, its own architecture, its own habits. The Romans, in their usual fashion, adapted and incorporated what they found while simultaneously imposing their own stamp on everything. The result was a city that was Roman in its governance and its language, and many of its cultural practices, but that retained beneath the surface, visible to anyone who looked carefully, the traces of everything that had come before. Pompeii was never purely anything, it was always a mixture, and that in the end is part of what makes it so endlessly fascinating. Rome arrives, the social war and Romanization. The year is 91 BCE. The Roman Republic, that extraordinary political experiment that had conquered most of the known world and would eventually give way to the empire, was facing one of the most serious internal crises of its history. The problem was, in essence, fairness, or rather the lack of it. For generations, the Italian peoples who lived alongside Rome, who fought in Rome's armies, who contributed to Rome's conquests and Rome's wealth, had been doing so without receiving Roman citizenship in return. They were allies, socii in Latin, which is where the war gets its name. They fought Roman battles and died Roman deaths. But they could not vote in Roman assemblies. They did not share fully in the political rights that Roman citizenship conferred. They paid taxes and they supplied legions and they participated in the economic life of the Republic. But they were, in a fundamental sense, second-class participants in a system that profited enormously from their cooperation. By 91 BCE, patience had run out. A large coalition of Italian peoples, including the Samnites and including Pompeii, rose in armed rebellion against Rome. They called their movement Italia, and they even minted their own coins bearing the image of an Italian bull goring the Roman wolf, which, as statements of political intent go, is fairly unambiguous. Pompeii was one of the cities that joined the rebellion. This was not a trivial decision. Pompeii was prosperous, well established, and had functional trade relationships with Rome. The decision to take up arms against the most powerful military force in the Mediterranean world required genuine conviction. The Pompeians and their Samnite neighbours believed that they had been treated unfairly for long enough. They were willing to fight to change that. The war lasted from 91 to 87 BCE. It was brutal and widespread. Battles were fought across central and southern Italy. Cities were besieged. Populations were displaced. The Italian countryside, usually so productive and peaceful, became a theatre of organised violence. Rome found itself fighting for its life against people who had learned Roman military tactics by fighting in Roman armies for generations. The Italians were formidable opponents, and Rome, to its credit, recognised this. Rome's response to the crisis combined military force with political concession, which was a characteristically pragmatic Roman solution. Even as the war was being fought, Rome began extending citizenship to those Italian communities that had either remained loyal or agreed to lay down their arms. The Lex Julia of 90 BCE and subsequent legislation progressively extended Roman citizenship to most of the Italian peninsula. By the time the war ended, the political grievance that had caused it had been substantially addressed, even if the process was messy and the implementation complicated. For Pompeii, the social war ended with a siege. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the Roman general who would go on to have one of the most dramatic and consequential careers in Roman political history, brought his forces to Pompeii and besieged the city. Sulla would later become dictator of Rome and fundamentally reshape the Republic's institutions. But in 89 BCE he was a commander with an immediate military objective: the reduction of Pompeian resistance. The siege left marks that are still visible today. Excavators working near the walls of Pompeii have found lead slingshot bullets from Sulla's troops inscribed with the general's name. These small, cold, heavy objects are extraordinarily direct connections to a specific military event nearly 2100 years ago. Someone loaded them, someone fired them, some of them hit something, and some did not, and the ones that did not have waited in the soil of Pompeii ever since. Pompeii capitulated. Exactly when and under what specific circumstances we do not know in complete detail. But the outcome is clear. The city became a Roman colony in 80 BCE, established under Sulla's authority. Its Latin name was Colonia Cornelia Veneria Pompeianorum, a mouthful that reflects both Sulla's family name, the Corneli, and the patronage of Venus, the goddess whom Sulla claimed as his particular divine protector. The first part of that name tells you whose victory it was. The second part tells you something about how Romans understood the relationship between politics and religion. Romanization came quickly to Pompeii, though not instantaneously, and not without friction. A significant number of Roman veterans were settled in the city as colonists. These were men who had served in Sulla's armies and been rewarded with land and property in the conquered communities. Their arrival disrupted the existing social order considerably. Property was confiscated from some Pompeian families to accommodate the new settlers. The existing elite found themselves negotiating a new political landscape in which they had to coexist with and accommodate a group of newcomers who had both military backing and Roman citizenship. The tension between the old Oscan Samnite elite of Pompeii and the new Roman colonists is one of the most interesting social dynamics of the city in the 1st century BCE. It was not simply a matter of conquerors and conquered, because the old families were also now Roman citizens and were participating in the new political institutions. It was more like the complicated politics of any city that has received a large influx of outsiders with connections to power. The newcomers had advantages. The existing families had roots, relationships, and local knowledge. Both groups had to figure out how to get along while competing for influence. The most visible sign of this tension and eventual accommodation was language. Oscan had been the language of Pompeii for centuries. Latin was the language of the Roman state and the new colonists. For a generation or two after the Social War, both languages coexisted in Pompeii. Public inscriptions appeared in both. By the 1st century CE, however, Latin had completely displaced Oscan as the language of public life. Oscan persisted perhaps in some domestic contexts, in some religious practices, in the speech of older and more conservative families, but it was dying. The last Oscan inscription at Pompeii probably dates to the period just after the Sullan colony was established. After that, silence. This is worth dwelling on for a moment because language is not just a practical tool. It is a carrier of identity, of memory, of the particular ways that a community understands the world and expresses itself. When Oscan died in Pompeii, something irreplaceable died with it. The specific way that the Samnite inhabitants of this city had been telling their stories, making their prayers, arguing with their neighbours, doing their business, all of that was gone. What replaced it was Latin, which is a magnificent language and which gave us Virgil and Cicero and Ovid, so one cannot be entirely mournful about its spread, but something particular to this place, something Oscan, something that had been developing here on the slopes of Vesuvius since before the Greeks arrived and the Etruscans came and went. That particular thing did not survive. The physical transformation of Pompeii under Roman influence was dramatic. The Forum was rebuilt and expanded into the monumental public space that we see in its excavated form today. The Basilica, the large covered hall used for commercial and legal business, was constructed. New temples were built or existing ones were rebuilt in the Roman style. The amphitheatre, one of the earliest known examples of that distinctly Roman building type anywhere in the Roman world, was constructed in about 70 BCE, within a few decades of the Sullan colony. The large theatre complex was rebuilt and expanded. The city acquired the full complement of civic buildings that characterized a proper Roman city. The language of Roman urbanism is very specific and very readable, once you know what to look for. A Roman city needed a forum, a central public space for commerce, politics, and religion. It needed a basilica for legal and commercial transactions. It needed at least one temple to Jupiter, who embodied the power of Rome itself, at the head of the forum. It needed baths for public hygiene and social interaction. It needed an amphitheatre for gladiatorial games and a theatre for dramatic performances. It needed a proper street grid, ideally organised around two main axes, the Cardo and the Decumanus, running roughly north-south and east-west. Pompeii, to be fair, did not have a perfectly regular street grid, because the grid had to accommodate an existing city that had been built up over centuries on an irregular lava plateau. The streets of Pompeii follow the logic of the terrain as much as any abstract planning principle. But the Roman civic buildings were inserted into the existing urban fabric with considerable skill, creating a city that felt genuinely Roman even as it retained the footprint of its pre-Roman past. The new political institutions of the Roman colony were also significant. Pompeii was now governed by elected magistrates using Roman titles, 2 duoviri who held the chief executive offices, 2 aediles who managed public infrastructure and public order, and a town council called the Ordo Decurionum made up of the city's propertied elite. Elections were held annually. Candidates campaigned for office. Votes were cast and counted. This was not Roman democracy in any modern sense, because participation was heavily weighted toward the wealthy and the well-connected. But it was a functioning system of local self-government within the broader framework of Roman authority. and it generated the extraordinary political culture that left its traces all over the walls of Pompeii in the form of painted electoral notices. We will explore that political culture in more detail when we walk through the Forum. For now, the key point is that by the 1st century BCE, Pompeii was Roman. Not Roman in the sense of having been absorbed and homogenized into something indistinguishable from Rome itself, because it retained its particular character, its local traditions, its specific history, but Roman in its institutions, its language, its law, and its cultural ambitions. It was a member, and an active member, of the Roman world, and the Roman world in the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE was an extraordinary thing to be a member of. It was a world of remarkable material comfort for those who could afford it, remarkable cultural richness and sophistication, and a degree of connectivity and trade that would not be surpassed in the Mediterranean for well over 1,000 years. Being a Roman city, even a relatively small and undistinguished Roman city, meant participating in that world, and Pompeii did participate, enthusiastically and with considerable style. The Forum, heart of a Roman city. If you could arrive in Pompeii on any ordinary Tuesday in the year 60 CE, and you wanted to understand this city as quickly as possible, the place to go would be the Forum. Not because it was the most beautiful place in the city, though it was certainly impressive, but because the Forum was the place where everything happened at once. Politics and commerce and religion and justice and gossip and public performance, all of it ran through this single space. Stand in the middle of it for an hour with your eyes open, and you would understand more about how this city worked than you could from any other vantage point. The Forum of Pompeii is one of the best preserved Roman public squares anywhere in the ancient world. A large elongated rectangle, roughly 150 metres long and 38 metres wide, oriented north to south, with the great temple of Jupiter dominating the northern end and civic and commercial buildings lining the long sides. When it was active, the square was paved in travertine limestone and surrounded by a 2-story colonnade that provided shade and defined the space. Statues stood throughout on pedestals still visible today, though the bronze figures they once supported were removed and melted down long ago. They honoured local benefactors, magistrates, members of the imperial family, gods. Let us walk through it, because it deserves the attention. You enter from the south, passing through a triumphal arch from the Via dell'Abbondanza. The scale of the space would have been striking even by modern standards. In a city of narrow streets and enclosed spaces, the open sky above the Forum was genuinely unusual. It was one of the few places in Pompeii where you could look up without a building crowding the edge of your vision. To your right, on the eastern side, is the Macellum, the city's main food market, identifiable by its large courtyard with a circular structure at the centre that once held a pool. Fish scales and bones found there suggest a live fish were kept for sale, which is either charming or alarming depending on your feelings about fish. Moving north along the eastern side, you reach the sanctuary of the public lares, the protective spirits of the city, a modest sacred space where making an offering was as much a civic act as a religious one. Further along was the Temple of Vespasian, dedicated to the emperor who would still be alive when the city was destroyed, though only just barely. And then the building of Eumachia, a large and elaborately decorated structure donated to the city by a wealthy woman and priestess of the same name, used by Pompeii's wool and cloth traders. Her name is on the facade in large letters. She could not hold political office. She put her name on a building anyway, and the city's guilds honoured her for it. There are ways around most obstacles, if you have enough money and enough nerve. On the western side are the administrative buildings, the Curia where the town council met, the Comitium where votes were cast in elections, and several offices whose precise functions remain uncertain. The southwestern corner is occupied by the Basilica, the largest building in Pompeii. A basilica in Roman terms is not a church. The building type predates Christianity by centuries. It is a large covered hall with a central nave flanking aisles and a raised tribunal at one end where magistrates dispense justice. Contracts were witnessed here. Disputes were heard. Business was conducted. It was the financial and legal heart of the city. And standing in its ruined shell today, you can still see the stubs of the column bases that once lined the nave, and imagine the noise of it. The lawyers and merchants and litigants all making their cases simultaneously. At the northern end, the Temple of Jupiter stands at the head of everything, on a tall podium reached by a long flight of stairs, housing cult statues of the Capitoline Triad, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. It was still under repair from the earthquake of 62 CE when Vesuvius erupted. Pompeii on the day of its destruction was not a finished city. It was a living city, mid-sentence, mid-repair, mid-becoming. The eruption caught it there and kept it. The elections held annually in the Forum generated one of the most remarkable bodies of political evidence to survive from the ancient world. Over 2,800 painted electoral notices remain legible on Pompeii's walls, recommending candidates in red and black letters on white plaster. Some endorsements came from guilds and professional bodies, some came from neighbours, and some, with a humour that crosses 20 centuries without losing anything, claim to come from the drunks and late-night revellers of a particular neighbourhood. Whether genuine or satirical we cannot say with certainty. Either way, it suggests a political culture that did not take itself entirely seriously, which is its own kind of reassurance. The Forum was the city speaking to itself about itself, and Vesuvius buried it mid-conversation, preserving it well enough that we can still, if we are quiet and paying attention, almost hear what it was saying. Home life in Pompeii, houses, gardens, and family. The Forum was the face that Pompeii showed to the world. But the houses are where the city's soul lived, and Pompeii's houses are in many ways the most intimate and revelatory things that the city has left us. Walk into one of the great Pompeian houses today, and you are stepping into a space that was designed to create specific impressions and serve specific social functions, but also a space where people ate breakfast and argued with their children and worried about money, and fell asleep listening to the sounds of the street. The typical Pompeian house of the upper and middle classes followed a plan that had been standard since at least the Samnite period. You entered through a narrow doorway from the street, passing through a short entrance corridor called the Forces, the Jaws, which is an evocative name that suggests the house is about to swallow you. It was also a subtle security device, since its narrowness made it easy to monitor who came in and out. The Forces opened into the atrium, the central and most important room of the house. High-ceilinged, with a rectangular opening in the roof called the compluvium, it allowed light and air to enter and directed rainwater into a shallow pool, below called the impluvium. This pool was often decorated with mosaic and might contain a small fountain. The atrium was where the household shrine stood, where visitors were received, where business was conducted. It was semi-public space, and its openness was entirely deliberate. At the back of the atrium opposite the entrance was the tablinum, the reception room and study of the paterfamilias. Open on two sides, to the atrium on one end and the garden on the other, it allowed the head of the household to be seen conducting his affairs. The Roman domestic space was designed in part as a stage set for the performance of social relationships. Everything was calculated. The visibility was the point. Beyond the tablinum lay the garden, and the garden is where Roman domestic architecture achieved something genuinely beautiful. The Romans loved gardens with a passion that seems deep and real rather than merely fashionable. A Pompeian garden was surrounded by a colonnaded peristyle and might contain a fountain, sculptures, fruit trees, and ornamental plants. The walls around it were often painted with trompe-l'oeil garden scenes that extended the visual space beyond its physical limits, dissolving the boundary between inside and outside, making small spaces feel abundant and alive. This is a very human desire, and it is touching to encounter it nearly 2,000 years later. The House of the Faun is the grandest of the great Pompeian houses. It takes its name from a small bronze statuette of a dancing faun found in the impluvium, now in the National Archaeological Museum of Naples. The house occupies an entire city block, has 2 atria, 2 gardens, and was almost certainly the home of one of the wealthiest families in Pompeii, probably of Samnite origin. Their identity we cannot confirm with certainty. Their taste and resources are spectacularly evident in everything they left behind. In the floor of a large room opening off the first garden, the family had laid the Alexander mosaic, which is arguably the most extraordinary work of art to survive from the ancient world. It depicts the Battle of Issus in 333 BCE, when Alexander the Great defeated the Persian king Darius III. It covers nearly 20 square meters of floor, composed of an estimated 1.5 million individually cut tesserae. Alexander charges on Bucephalus, bareheaded and fierce. Darius begins to turn away in his chariot. The scene around them is organized chaos rendered with breathtaking skill. The family that commissioned this was making a statement in the language of art. We are people who matter. Other houses tell quieter but equally interesting stories. The house of the Vetii belonged to 2 brothers, Aulus Vettius Restitutus and Aulus Vettius Conviva, who were freed slaves who had made their fortunes in trade. Their names give them away, as freedmen typically took the family name of their former master. The vetii could not hold the highest civic offices, they were not on the town council, but they could own a house of this quality, commission its extraordinary frescoes, and host dinner parties where they displayed their taste and prosperity to guests. In the particular social economy of a city like Pompeii, money went a considerable way toward closing the gap between formal legal status and everyday social reality. The domestic economy of a Roman house depended entirely on enslaved labour, and any honest account of Roman life has to say so plainly. Slaves cooked, cleaned, educated the children, and ran the household in its every function. They were property. Their relationships had no legal recognition, and yet the archaeological record suggests complications. Some enslaved people were given autonomy in their own economic affairs. Some saved money and purchased their freedom. Some went on to become the very kind of prosperous freedmen that the vetii represented. The system was monstrous in its fundamentals. The individual human relationships within it were, as human relationships always are, varied and difficult to categorize. The rhythms of the domestic day began early. A light breakfast, then the morning's business. Markets at their peak before the heat arrived. The main meal in the late afternoon, and then evening and lamps being lit and the street quieting, and someone's feet tired and someone else's children finally asleep, and somewhere very far beneath the earth, something ancient and enormous and completely uninterested in human schedules was slowly waking up. Streets, shops, and taverns. The everyday city. The streets of Pompeii are where the city really lives for me. The forum is magnificent, and the houses are intimate, and the temples are solemn, but the streets are where you feel closest to the actual texture of daily life, where the sheer ordinariness of the ancient world becomes most apparent and most moving, because the streets of Pompeii were just streets, where people walked to work and argued about prices and stepped around a pile of something they would rather not identify. Real streets, used by real people. The main east-west artery is the Via dell'Abbondanza, the Street of Abundance, running almost the full length of the city from the Forum to the Eastern Gate. The streets are paved in large irregular blocks of dark basalt, hard and durable, and if you look at the surface today, you can see the deep grooves worn into the stone by cartwheels over decades of use. The carts that made these grooves were of a fairly standard width, a de facto standardization that emerged not from any planning decree but simply from the practical necessity of fitting through narrow streets. Infrastructure by accident. Romans were good at that. The streets are crossed at intervals by stepping stones, large raised blocks of basalt placed so pedestrians could cross without stepping in whatever was currently flowing along the gutter, and things did flow along the gutter. Roman cities were not clean places by modern standards. The stepping stones were a practical acknowledgement that the street surface was not always something you wanted to put your feet in. Around 40 public fountains distributed throughout the city ensured that no inhabitant had to walk too far for fresh water, fed by a branch of the Augustan aqueduct that served the entire Bay of Naples region. Before the aqueduct, the city had depended on wells and rainwater cisterns. The aqueduct was one of the most significant quality of life improvements in Pompeii's history, and it is the kind of thing that rarely gets the appreciation it deserves. The most common commercial establishments on the streets were the thermopolia, essentially food counters built into the street frontage of buildings, with long stone surfaces and large terracotta jars, dolia, sunk into them holding food kept warm from below. Customers walked up, chose what they wanted, ate standing or took it away. Sound familiar? In 2019 and 20, archaeologists excavating the Regio Fiv area uncovered a thermopolium in extraordinary condition. The food still present in the dolia: duck bones, pig bones, fish bones, land snails, beef, seasonings, a painted menu on the front of the counter, a small painting of a dog that may have been the establishment's logo. The barrier between then and now, which in most of history feels impenetrable, becomes in that moment almost transparent. The food is still there. It has simply been waiting. Over 80 thermopolia have been identified in Pompeii's excavated area, which is a striking density. Most Pompeians did not have fully equipped kitchens. Fuel was expensive. Space in smaller homes was limited. Eating out was not a luxury. It was a practical accommodation to urban life, and in this respect the Romans were thoroughly modern. Bakeries are immediately identifiable from their millstones, large conical blocks of volcanic basalt worn smooth by the circular motion of the donkeys that turned them for decades. Some of the ovens still contain carbonized loaves from the morning of the eruption, bread placed in an oven, baked, set aside, and never eaten because something else happened. One of those loaves has been sitting in the National Archaeological Museum of Naples for 250 years, still divided into 8 wedge-shaped segments for easy breaking, still recognizable as exactly what it is. There were also garum factories, which produced the fermented fish sauce that Romans used the way we use soy sauce, and which were apparently not beloved neighbours for reasons that require no further explanation, and fulleries, where cloth was cleaned by trampling it in vats of collected human urine, because the ammonia works and someone had to do it. I mention this not to be unpleasant, but because the Roman city was a functioning human community, not a sanitized display. Frescoes and urine vats, wine and sewage in the gutters, both true simultaneously in the same small space. Over 100 bars have been identified in Pompeii. One near the Herculaneum Gate has wall paintings showing 2 men arguing over a dice game, their dispute captured in painted speech bubbles above their heads. One says he has won, the other says he has not. That argument is still going. Baths, bodies, and public life. Leisure in a Roman city. The Roman relationship with the body was, to put it gently, different from our own, not in all respects. The Romans worried about their health, valued physical fitness, took pleasure in food and wine and sex, and grew old and sick and died in ways that would be completely familiar to us. But in some specific ways, the Roman attitude to the body was organised around social practices that have no real modern equivalent, and the most important of these was bathing. Bathing for Romans was not primarily a private act of personal hygiene, it was a public social activity. The thermae, or public baths, were among the most important social institutions of any Roman city, places where people of different social backgrounds gathered daily, not just to clean themselves but to exercise, to talk, to conduct business, to hear news, and to participate in the ongoing social negotiation that characterized Roman urban life. Going to the baths was not a chore. It was an event. It was, in some ways, the Roman equivalent of the forum in its social function, but more democratic and more physically intimate. Pompeii had at least 3 major bath complexes in operation by the 1st century CE, as well as several smaller private bath establishments. The forum baths, the Stabian baths, and the central baths represent different periods of construction and different scales of ambition, and together they give us an excellent picture of how the bathing institution evolved over the period of Pompeii's Roman history. The Stabian baths are the oldest of the major complexes, with origins going back to the 2nd century BCE, though they were substantially rebuilt and expanded in the Roman period. They are also the most complete and best preserved, which makes them the best guide to how the bathing experience actually worked. The complex has separate sections for men and women, reflecting the Roman norm of sex-segregated bathing, each with the same sequence of rooms that a typical Roman bather would pass through. You began in the appetiterium, the changing room, where you left your clothes. You were strongly advised to keep an eye on them because bath thieves were apparently a constant nuisance in Roman bathhouses. Graffiti from various Roman sites warn against leaving valuables unattended, and Roman legal texts discuss the theft of clothing at baths with enough frequency to suggest it was a recognised social problem. Security was not the strong suit of the ancient world. From the changing room you moved to the frigidarium, the cold room, which contained a cold pool for a quick dip, then to the tepidarium, the warm room, which served as a transitional space where your body could adjust to the heat, and then to the caldarium, the hot room, which contained both a large communal hot bath and a basin of cold water for splashing yourself, because the Romans understood that extreme heat required some cooling offset. The heat in the caldarium was produced by the Hippocus system, one of the great engineering achievements of Roman civilization. Under the floor of the heated rooms, a layer of airspace was created by raising the floor on small pilasters, brick columns about a foot high. Hot air from a furnace beneath the building was circulated through this underfloor space, heating the floor from below. The walls were also hollow, with heat circulating through ceramic tubes embedded in them. The result was a room that was warm from all directions, not just from a central heat source, and which could be maintained at a consistent temperature regardless of the weather outside. The social experience of the baths was as important as the physical one. People talked. Men discussed business, politics, and philosophy while sitting in the hot bath. The bathhouses were gathering points for news and gossip. They were places where social networks were maintained and extended. A wealthy patron might meet with clients at the baths as easily as at his house. A merchant might negotiate a deal while both parties were submerged in the hot pool. The bath removed certain social formalities along with the clothing, and the resulting informality, while not eliminating social hierarchy, softened it somewhat. The palestra, the exercise ground, attached to most of the bath complexes was where physical exercise happened before bathing. Romans exercised for health rather than for sport generally, though competitive athletics was certainly not unknown. Ball games, wrestling and weights were all practiced in the palestra. The palestra of the Stabian baths had a swimming pool in the centre, which was unusual and suggests a degree of competitive swimming practice as well. The amphitheatre of Pompeii is one of the oldest surviving examples of that building type in the Roman world, built around 70 BCE, shortly after the establishment of the Sullan colony. It could hold approximately 20,000 spectators, which is a remarkable number for a city of Pompeii's size. Gladiatorial games and wild animal hunts were the primary events, and they drew audiences not only from Pompeii itself, but from the surrounding towns and countryside. On game days, the city would have been considerably more crowded than its normal population would suggest. The gladiatorial games are one of the aspects of Roman culture that modern people find most difficult to understand sympathetically. The deliberate, organised killing of human beings for public entertainment is so far outside our contemporary moral framework that it requires genuine effort to understand how it functioned within Roman culture. And it did function within Roman culture, not as an aberration or a guilty pleasure, but as an accepted and publicly endorsed social institution with deep religious, political and social significance. Gladiators were in many cases slaves or prisoners of war. But the profession also attracted free volunteers, men who saw gladiatorial combat as a route to fame, money, and a certain kind of celebrity that was not available through other means. The most successful gladiators were genuine celebrities, with fan bases that expressed their admiration in graffiti on the walls of their city. The gladiator Celadus appears in Pompeian graffiti described as the glory of the girls and the delight of the girls, clearly a star performer who attracted female admirers. Whether those admirers admired him for his combat skills or his personal appearance, or some combination of the two, is not entirely clear, but the celebrity worship is unmistakable. The amphitheatre of Pompeii achieved a specific kind of notoriety in 59 CE, when a riot broke out between Pompeian spectators and visitors from the neighbouring town of Nuceria. The account of this event, preserved by the historian Tacitus, describes the riot beginning with taunts and insults, escalating to stone throwing, and eventually to drawn weapons, resulting in deaths and serious injuries on both sides. The Emperor Nero, in response, banned gladiatorial games at Pompeii for 10 years, which must have been considered a very significant punishment for a city that took its entertainment seriously. The riot tells us interesting things about the social dynamics of Roman provincial cities. Local rivalries were real and could be intense. The games provided an occasion for their expression. The communal excitement of watching gladiatorial combat, combined with the consumption of considerable quantities of wine and the presence of large numbers of people from rival communities, was a volatile mixture. This particular riot was unusual enough to be recorded by Tacitus, which suggests that it exceeded the normal level of game day disorder. But it also implies that a certain degree of disorder was expected and tolerated. Health and medicine in Pompeii existed at the intersection of practical knowledge and religious belief, as was typical throughout the ancient world. Pompeii had at least one building identified as a medical establishment, and several individuals are identified in inscriptions as physicians. Roman medicine in the 1st century CE was sophisticated enough to perform surgery, to manage chronic conditions with medicinal preparations, and to diagnose a range of illnesses with reasonable accuracy. But it also operated within a religious framework in which disease was understood as potentially divine in origin, and in which temple medicine and prayer were as legitimate as the surgical knife. The cult of Asclepius, the Greek god of healing, had no known temple at Pompeii, but healing practices associated with him were known throughout the Roman world. The household shrines that existed in almost every Pompeian house served partly as places where family members prayed for health and made offerings in thanks for recovery. The boundary between medicine and religion was not a firm one in the Roman world, and most Pompeians would not have understood the distinction we would draw. Leisure in Pompeii, then, was not merely amusement. It was woven into the fabric of social life, into religious practice, into political culture, and into the daily rhythms of the city. The baths were social institutions. The games were religious and political performances as well as entertainment. Exercise and physical health were civic virtues as much as personal goods. The Roman city was a city in the full sense, a community organised around shared public life and shared public spaces, and Pompeii participated in this tradition with its own particular energy and character. Religion, gods, and the sacred city religion in Pompeii was everywhere. That is not an exaggeration or a metaphor. It was literally everywhere, inscribed into the physical fabric of the city in ways that made the sacred inseparable from the everyday. You could not walk from your house to the Forum without passing a street shrine. You could not enter a shop without seeing the lararium of the owner. You could not look at the skyline of the city without seeing the rooflines of temples. The gods were present in Pompeii the way traffic noise is present in a modern city. Constant, pervasive, and largely unremarked upon because it was simply the condition of existence. This is very different from the relationship most people in the modern Western world have with religion, and it is worth acknowledging that difference clearly before we go any further. The Romans did not, as a rule, have the kind of personal, interior, spiritually intense religious experience that characterizes many modern religious traditions. The Roman relationship with the gods was primarily transactional. You made offerings and prayers. The gods in return were expected to provide specific benefits: health, success in business, a good harvest, victory in battle, a safe childbirth. If the gods failed to deliver, you might try a different god, or make a larger offering, or seek a different form of religious intervention. This was not cynicism. It was a perfectly coherent theological framework. It was simply very different from what we tend to mean by religion today. The official religion of Pompeii was the Roman state religion, organized around the Olympian gods and the imperial cult. The great temple at the head of the Forum was dedicated to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, the Capitoline triad, who embodied the power and authority of Rome itself. Worshipping Jupiter was in a sense a civic act as much as a religious one. Acknowledging Jupiter's supremacy was acknowledging Rome's supremacy, and the two were deliberately conflated. The Temple of Apollo at the edge of the Forum was dedicated to one of the most popular gods in the Roman world, a god of light, reason, music, prophecy, and healing, who had been at the center of Roman religious life since at least the 5th century BCE, and whose prestige had been amplified enormously by his association with the Emperor Augustus, who claimed Apollo as his divine patron. The Temple of Apollo in Pompeii was one of the oldest sacred sites in the city, as we noted earlier, going back in some form to the 6th century BCE. By the 1st century CE, it was a beautifully maintained sanctuary with its colonnade, its cult statue, and its altar in the open air in front of the temple, where sacrifices were performed. The sanctuary of Venus was also significant, given that Venus was the patroness of the Sullan colony and had been claimed as the city's special protector since the establishment of Roman rule. There were several sanctuaries of Venus in Pompeii, and the goddess appeared frequently in the painted decoration of private houses and in the small terracotta figurines that were produced as votive offerings and personal devotional objects. But the religious landscape of 1st century Pompeii was not limited to the Roman state religion. The city was also home to religious traditions from the Eastern Mediterranean that had spread across the Roman world along with trade and migration. The most important of these for Pompeii was the cult of Isis. Isis was an Egyptian goddess whose origins lay in the ancient pharaonic religious tradition, but who had been radically transformed and Hellenized in the Ptolemaic period and had subsequently spread across the Mediterranean world as one of the most popular mystery cults of the Roman imperial period. The appeal of Isis was multifaceted. She was a goddess of love and magic, of protection and healing. She was strongly associated with the resurrection of her husband Osiris, which gave her cult a significance around themes of death and renewal that distinguished it from the relatively transactional official Roman religion. And her mystery cult offered initiates a genuine religious experience, a direct personal encounter with the divine that promised transformation and salvation. The Temple of Isis in Pompeii is one of the best preserved temples of that goddess anywhere in the Roman world, and its history tells an interesting story. It was destroyed in the earthquake of 62 CE and was rebuilt almost immediately, at the expense of a freed slave named Numerius Papidius Celsinus, who was at the time of the restoration only 6 years old. His father, a freed slave who was himself barred from membership in the town council, by his servile origins, donated the money in his son's name, and the boy was duly admitted to the Ordo Decurionum as a reward. This transaction, which is recorded in an inscription that still stands at the site, tells us several things simultaneously. It tells us about the patronage system that funded civic building in Roman cities. It tells us about the mechanisms by which wealth could overcome the formal disabilities of freed slave status. And it tells us about the importance of the cult of Isis in Pompeii, since the temple's rapid rebuilding after the earthquake suggests a committed and well-resourced community of devotees. The rituals performed at the Temple of Isis were more elaborate and more emotionally engaging than those of the state religion. Twice daily, morning and evening, ceremonies were conducted with music, incense, and the dramatic display of sacred water from the Nile. Initiates underwent a process of spiritual preparation that could last days or weeks. The priests of Isis, including both male and female officiants, maintained a round-the-clock ritual schedule that kept the temple continuously active. The community of Isis worshippers in Pompeii clearly felt themselves to be members of a genuine religious fellowship, in a way that is different from the more civic and transactional character of Jupiter worship. At the household level, religion was practiced every single day by virtually every family in Pompeii. The lararium, the household shrine, was the domestic religious centre and could range from a simple niche painted with images of the lares and the genius of the paterfamilias to an elaborate miniature temple structure with painted scenes and a selection of small terracotta or bronze figurines. The lares were the spirits of the ancestors who protected the household, typically depicted as two young men in dancing poses holding a drinking horn. The genius was the divine double of the living paterfamilias, the generative spirit of the family line. Both received regular offerings of incense, small cakes, honey, and occasionally wine. Meals in the Roman household had a religious dimension as well. Before eating, a portion of food was typically offered to the household gods on a small vessel placed on the table. This was not elaborate ritual. It was the kind of brief habitual gesture that integrates religious practice into the fabric of daily life without requiring sustained conscious attention. The Romans were experts at this kind of habitual religion, at making the sacred a normal and unremarkable part of ordinary existence. Street shrines, called edicule, were placed at crossroads and intersections throughout the city. These were public shrines maintained collectively by the neighbourhood, dedicated to the lares compitales, the lares of the crossroads, who protected the community at the place where boundaries met and different neighbourhoods came into contact. The August holidays included a festival of the crossroad shrines, the compitalia, when neighbourhoods celebrated together and the shrines were decorated and offerings were made. These neighbourhood festivals reinforced local community bonds in a city where the residential blocks, the insula, functioned as significant social units. Augury and divination were also part of everyday religious life. The Romans took the interpretation of omens very seriously, at an official level and at a personal level. Before any major undertaking, an augur might be consulted to determine whether the signs were favourable. The flight of birds, the feeding behaviour of sacred chickens, the appearance of the entrails of sacrificial animals, lightning, unusual natural phenomena, and dreams all carried potential significance as messages from the divine. In a world where so much was uncertain, and where the causes of disease, crop failure, fire, and accident were not understood in scientific terms, the interpretation of omens was a rational response to the need for guidance in an unpredictable world. The religious life of Pompeii was, in this sense, not separate from daily life, but woven through it completely. From the morning ritual at the lararium to the prayers offered at the crossroad shrine, from the monthly sacrifice at the Temple of Jupiter to the private devotion to Isis performed by committed initiates, religion provided both a framework for understanding the world and a set of practical tools for navigating its uncertainties. That the tools did not, in the end, protect Pompeii from the event that destroyed it is one of the profound and terrible ironies of the city's story, and we will return to that irony in due course. Art, frescoes, and the visual world of Pompeii. There is a moment that many people describe when they visit Pompeii for the first time. You have been walking through the ruins, which are impressive but which can start to feel somewhat grey and repetitive if you have been at it for a while, especially in summer heat, when you step into a house where the frescoes are intact on the walls and suddenly everything changes. The colour is astonishing. Vivid reds, deep blues, rich ochres, sharp blacks, all perfectly preserved by the volcanic material that buried and protected them for nearly 2,000 years. And you realise that the grey stone ruins are not what Pompeii actually looked like. This is what Pompeii actually looked like. This richness, this colour, this deliberate and sophisticated visual environment. The wall paintings of Pompeii are among the most important sources we have for Roman art as a whole, because Roman painting elsewhere has largely disappeared. Paintings on wooden panels rotted. Paintings on the walls of buildings in Rome and other cities were damaged by the weather and by the centuries. Pompeii, uniquely, preserved a vast body of painted decoration in something approaching its original condition, giving us a window into the visual culture of the Roman world that we would otherwise simply not have. Archaeologists studying Pompeian painting have identified 4 distinct styles, conventionally named the 1st through 4th styles, which reflect different aesthetic fashions at different periods of the city's history. These styles overlap and interact with each other, and a given room might contain elements of more than one, but the typology is useful as a rough guide to the chronological and aesthetic development of Pompeian painting. The first style, which dates roughly to the 2nd and early 1st centuries BCE, is the simplest and in some ways the most architecturally coherent. It consists primarily of painted stucco that imitates marble revetment. The expensive marble panelling that wealthy Romans used on the walls of important buildings, the walls are divided into panels by painted pilasters and horizontal bands, and the panels themselves are painted to simulate the colour and texture of different types of marble and stone. This was aspirational decoration. Not everyone could afford actual marble, but everyone could have the appearance of marble, and in the visual economy of the Roman house, appearance mattered enormously. The second style, roughly 1st century BCE to early 1st century CE, represents a dramatic expansion of pictorial ambition, where the first style was essentially architectural and two-dimensional in its effects. The second style burst through the wall surface to create the illusion of three-dimensional space. Columns and pilasters in trompe-l'oeil paint appeared to project from the wall surface. Architectural vistas opened up behind them, apparently showing gardens, buildings, and landscapes extending far beyond the physical boundaries of the room. Figures appeared in these painted spaces, sometimes mythological, sometimes theatrical, sometimes simply decorative. The second style, at its most ambitious, creates an extraordinary effect of spatial expansion in rooms that might physically be quite small. You stand in a room of modest actual dimensions, and you seem to be surrounded by vast architectural spaces that extend endlessly outward. This is a sophisticated and technically demanding achievement, requiring painters with considerable skill in perspective and architectural draftsmanship, and it reflects the cultural ambitions of Pompeii's elite in the late Republican and early Imperial period. The third style, roughly from the reign of Augustus into the mid-1st century CE, represents a shift in the opposite direction. Where the second style opened the wall to infinite vistas, the third style reasserts the flatness of the wall surface and treats it as a field for delicate ornamental painting. The painted architectural elements become slender, elegant, almost impossibly attenuated forms that no real structure could support. Small central panel paintings appear as jewels set into elaborately ornamented flat surfaces, depicting mythological scenes, landscapes, or genre subjects with exquisite miniaturist quality. The third style is sophisticated and somewhat precious, reflecting a moment when Roman aesthetics valued refinement and controlled elegance. The fourth style, which dominates the latest phase of Pompeian painting, roughly mid-1st century CE to 79, is the most theatrical and in some ways the most complex. It combines elements of all 3 earlier styles, mixing architectural illusion with flat ornamental surfaces and inserting panel paintings of mythological subjects into elaborate composite schemes. The fourth style is extravagant and confident and sometimes slightly overblown, reflecting the taste of a prosperous commercial city at the height of its confidence. Many of the most famous frescoes in Pompeii belong to the fourth style. The subjects of Pompeian painting are enormously varied. Greek mythology was overwhelmingly popular, with scenes from the Iliad and the Odyssey, from the myths of Hercules and Bacchus, from the stories of Venus and Mars and Jupiter, and all the Olympian family appearing in house after house. These were not merely decorative choices. A painting of Hercules performing his labours in your tablinum was a cultural statement. It identified you as educated, as familiar with the Greek literary and mythological tradition, as belonging to a world of culture and refinement. The mythological scenes in Pompeian houses are the visual equivalent of the literary allusions in Roman poetry. They signal membership in a shared cultural community. Genre scenes also appear, images of daily life, market scenes, theatrical performances, erotic subjects, still life paintings of food, wine, and objects. These are less culturally coded than the mythological paintings and more immediately accessible. The still life paintings of Pompeii, sometimes called xenia from the Greek word for hospitality gifts, depict the kinds of food that might be offered to a guest or that adorned a good table: fish, game birds, fruit, nuts, bread, wine vessels. They are virtuoso demonstrations of the painter's skill in depicting texture and surface quality, and they are frankly appetizing even 2,000 years after the objects they depict have long since ceased to exist. The mosaics of Pompeii are a separate but related art form, and they deserve their own consideration. Mosaic floors were among the most expensive and prestigious decorative elements in a Roman house, requiring skilled craftsmen, expensive materials, and considerable time to execute. The range of mosaic types in Pompeii spans from simple geometric patterns in black and white to elaborate figured compositions of great complexity. We have already mentioned the Alexander mosaic from the House of the Faun, which is the supreme example of the grand figured mosaic. But even the more modest mosaics of Pompeii have considerable artistic interest. Floor mosaics of fish and sea creatures are particularly common in the dining rooms and triclinia of Pompeian houses, where their maritime subjects would have been appropriate to a room associated with feasting and conviviality. Some of these fish mosaics are executed with such naturalistic accuracy that marine biologists have been able to identify specific species, an extraordinary testament to the observational skill of the ancient mosaicists. The famous mosaic inscribed with Cave Canem, Beware of the Dog, found at the entrance of a house on the Via dell'Abbondanza, shows a dog on a leash in a posture that manages to be simultaneously menacing and somewhat comic. Whether it was intended as a genuine warning, as decoration, or as a joke about the extremely mild-mannered actual dog who presumably lived on the premises, we cannot know. But it has become one of the most reproduced images from Pompeii, and it shares something with the best of Pompeian art generally: a directness, an engagement with ordinary life, a willingness to be both functional and humorous simultaneously. The question of who made all this art is rarely addressed in popular accounts of Pompeii, but it is an interesting one. The names of very few Pompeian painters and mosaicists are known to us, because artisans were not generally accorded the kind of biographical attention that literary culture received. But some names do appear. A painter named Lucius signed a work in the house of Pinarius Cerialis. A mosaicist named Dioscorides is known from signed works in the nearby villa of Cicero. These names suggest that artists might sometimes sign works of exceptional ambition or quality, even if this was not the norm. The painters who worked in Pompeii were part of a professional craft tradition that trained its practitioners through apprenticeship, and that maintained standards and conventions that were consistent enough across the city to suggest some form of shared training or communication between workshops. They were skilled professionals with practical mastery of complex techniques, the preparation of plaster surfaces, the mixing and application of mineral-based pigments, the execution of complex figurative compositions freehand on a wet plaster surface that could not be corrected once the plaster had dried. They were not, in the Roman estimation, artists in the elevated sense that we now give that word. They were craftsmen, workers in a skilled trade. But they left behind a body of work that continues to move and astonish people, and in the particular circumstances of Pompeii's destruction and preservation, their work has achieved a kind of immortality that no amount of patronage or cultural status could have bought them. They painted walls in an ordinary city by the sea, and those walls endured. The earthquake of 62 CE, a warning ignored. On a day in February in 62, CE, possibly the 5th of February, though some scholars argue for 63 CE, and the debate remains technically unresolved, which I mention because I like to be honest about uncertainty, the ground beneath Pompeii shook, not gently, not as a minor tremor of the kind that the residents of volcanic Campania were accustomed to feeling occasionally and ignoring. This was a serious earthquake, violent enough to cause widespread structural damage across Pompeii and the surrounding region. Buildings collapsed, water mains ruptured, the marble revetment of the forum's buildings cracked and fell, statues toppled from their bases, the temples were damaged, and at the baths the walls cracked, and the beautiful plasterwork fell in chunks from the heated rooms. It was by any measure a serious disaster. The Roman philosopher and statesman Seneca, who was alive at the time and who provides the most detailed written account of the earthquake, describes widespread destruction and general panic. He also notes that a flock of 600 sheep in the area of Pompeii were all killed, which seems like a peculiar detail but probably reflects the release of volcanic gas from the disturbed ground, something that would be deadly to animals concentrated in a low-lying field but might not be noticed by people moving around more freely. Seneca discusses the earthquake at some length, because it provided him with a convenient example for a philosophical discussion about the nature of fear. He was a Stoic philosopher, and Stoics were professionally interested in appropriate responses to danger. His account of the earthquake is useful but filtered through his philosophical agenda, which means it tells us something about the event and rather a lot about Seneca. The damage to Pompeii was significant enough that reconstruction was still ongoing at the time of the eruption 17 years later. We know this from the archaeological evidence: unfinished building projects, scaffolding still in place, public buildings that had not yet been restored to their pre-earthquake condition. The Temple of Jupiter at the head of the Forum, as we noted earlier, was still not fully repaired. Several bath establishments were still under renovation. Some private houses that had been badly damaged had been demolished, and their sites stood empty or partially rebuilt. The earthquake of 62 CE left Pompeii in a state of extended reconstruction that is visible in the archaeological record if you know where to look. The human cost of the earthquake is difficult to assess from our distance. The written sources mention casualties and displacement but do not give specific numbers. Archaeological evidence of burials or mass graves from this period is limited, which might suggest that casualties, while real, were not catastrophic. Many people presumably left the city during and after the earthquake, and some may not have returned. The population of Pompeii in 79 CE may have been somewhat lower than it had been before the earthquake as a result of this temporary or permanent displacement. What is most striking about the earthquake of 62 CE from our retrospective vantage point is what it was. It was a warning. It was the Earth communicating in its geological language that something significant was happening beneath the surface of Campania. We now know, with the benefit of modern volcanology, that earthquakes in the region of Vesuvius are almost always connected to volcanic activity. The movement of magma underground, the building of pressure in the volcanic system, the shifting of rock masses as they are heated and stressed by the rising magma, all of these processes produce seismic activity. The earthquake of 62 CE was, in all likelihood, a precursor to the eruption of 79 CE, a 17-year-long prelude to the main event. The Romans did not know this. They could not have known this, because the scientific understanding of the connection between earthquakes and volcanic activity did not exist in the 1st century CE. Seneca's discussion of the earthquake treats it as a purely physical phenomenon driven by the movement of air or water through underground cavities, the prevailing theory of the time. Nobody in the Roman world connected the Campanian earthquakes to the sleeping volcano that loomed above the city. Vesuvius had not erupted in recorded memory. It was just a mountain, and so the people of Pompeii responded to the earthquake of 62 CE the way that people always respond to disasters that do not kill them. They cleaned up, they mourned their dead, they assessed the damage, they made their insurance claims to whatever ancient equivalents of insurance existed, which were limited and complicated, and they started rebuilding. The practical Roman response to adversity was not to abandon a good location because something bad had happened there. It was to fix what was broken and get on with life. Some wealthy families did leave Pompeii after the earthquake, apparently permanently. The evidence for this comes from large houses that show signs of having been divided up into smaller units or converted from private residences to commercial uses after 62 CE, suggesting that their original owners had departed and the properties had been taken over by others with different needs and resources. This kind of residential mobility following a disaster is perfectly comprehensible. If you had another property elsewhere, or the means to establish yourself in a different city, and if the prospect of rebuilding in a damaged Pompeii was daunting, leaving was a rational choice, but most people stayed. The city rebuilt itself, imperfectly and incompletely, over the following years and decades. New owners bought damaged properties and adapted them to their purposes. Buildings were repaired with whatever materials were available, which is why archaeologists find in some Pompeian walls a patchwork of different building materials and periods, earlier stonework next to later brickwork next to recycled stone. The city had a certain resourceful scruffiness about it in the years leading up to 79 CE, the look of a place that had been knocked around and was doing its best with what it had. The water supply was one of the most significant casualties of the earthquake and its aftermath. Pompeii's water system, fed by the aqueduct from the Aqua Augusta, depended on lead pipe networks that were vulnerable to ground movement. After the earthquake, parts of the pipe network may have been disrupted, and there is evidence that some areas of the city were receiving less water than they had been before. This matters for our understanding of the final days of the city, because one of the signs of volcanic unrest in the weeks before an eruption is often disruption to underground water systems, as rising magma heats and displaces groundwater. If Pompeii's water supply was already disrupted by earthquake damage, it may have been difficult to distinguish additional disruption caused by pre-eruption volcanic activity from the ongoing effects of the 62 CE earthquake. There is something deeply human about the response to the earthquake of 62 CE. The people of Pompeii did everything right by the standards available to them. They rebuilt. They restored their temples and their public buildings, perhaps imperfectly and incompletely, but with genuine effort. They did not panic and flee. They faced adversity with the practical resilience that characterized Roman culture at its best. They could not have known that they were cleaning up after a foreshock of a volcanic eruption that would kill them. They had no way of knowing that. In the categories available to them, they had survived an earthquake and were rebuilding. That was the whole story. The geology was indifferent to their categories. The summer of 79 CE. Life in the final days August in Campania. The heat is considerable. The kind of heat that settles over the Bay of Naples in the middle of summer and makes the air shimmer above the paving stones and drives sensible people indoors during the middle hours of the day. The bay itself would have been brilliant blue, sometimes with a silvery haze above it, and the fishing boats would have been out in the early morning and the late evening when the heat was manageable. Vesuvius rose behind the city as it always had, green on its lower slopes, the summit sometimes capped with a thin cloud, apparently as it had always been. Pompeii in August of 79 CE was busy with the normal business of a prosperous commercial city at the height of summer. The evidence for this busyness is preserved in extraordinary detail because the eruption preserved it. The graffiti on the walls of the city includes electoral notices that are clearly recent, the paint still crisp and clean. There is evidence of an ongoing festival at the time of the eruption, possibly the Vulcanalia, the festival of the god Vulcan who was associated with fire and the forge, which fell on the 23rd of August. One does not know whether to find this detail tragically ironic or simply coincidental. The Romans would probably have found it meaningful. The god of fire was being honoured the day before the mountain of fire destroyed them. The harvest season was underway. The grapes of Campania were ripening and would have been ready for picking in the coming weeks. The agricultural calendar of the region meant that late August was a time of intense activity in the vineyards, and many of the workers who might normally have been found in and around Pompeii would have been occupied with agricultural work in the fields beyond the city walls. The fact that the eruption happened when it did, at this particular point in the annual cycle, had implications for who was where when the disaster struck. The markets of Pompeii were active. An extraordinary piece of evidence for this is the contents of various vessels and jars found in the city, which include seasonal foods appropriate to late August. Nuts, dried fruits, preserved fish, jars of garum, amphoras of wine and olive oil. The shops were stocked. The thermopolia had their dolia full, the bakers had their ovens fired. It was an ordinary commercial day, or at any rate it began as one. Something was not quite right, though. The water supply had been behaving oddly in the weeks before the eruption. This is now well documented from the analysis of the water system and from testimony preserved in the letters of Pliny the Younger, who provides our most important first-hand account of the eruption. The underground springs that fed wells in the region had been drying up or becoming disturbed. The level of water in some of the city's fountains had dropped or become intermittent. This was probably connected to the intense geological activity beneath the surface, as rising magma displaced groundwater and disturbed the underground systems. There is also evidence of unusual animal behaviour in the days before the eruption. This is harder to document from the archaeological record alone, but the ancient world was full of accounts of animals behaving strangely before earthquakes and volcanic events, and modern volcanology suggests that animals can sometimes detect pre-eruption ground movement and gas emissions before humans do. Whether the animals of Pompeii in August of 79 CE were signalling something to the humans around them, and whether any of those humans were paying attention, we cannot know. What we do know is that the final days of Pompeii were ordinary days. People woke up, ate breakfast, went to the baths, argued in the forum, sold fish in the macellum, drank wine in the caupone, made love, made plans, worried about money, watched the children, made offerings at the lararium. The ordinary machinery of daily life ran its ordinary course. The election notices on the walls promised a future in which political careers would be pursued and civic offices filled, and the normal competition of ambition would continue. The builders at work on the still unrepaired Temple of Jupiter presumably expected to be back at their scaffolding the next morning. There is a particular poignancy to the evidence of things in progress, things that would not be completed. A meal laid out on a table in a house near the Forum, apparently abandoned in mid-preparation. A set of surgical instruments carefully arranged in their case, ready for use. A collection of tools and materials assembled for a renovation job that was going to start soon. A woman's jewellery laid out, apparently ready to be put on. These are not particularly dramatic objects. They are ordinary objects in ordinary states of readiness. That is exactly what makes them devastating. The morning of the 24th of August dawned normally, as far as we can tell. The sky was clear or partly cloudy. The sun was rising over the bay. The city was waking up and beginning its day. If there were any signs of what was coming, they were either not recognized for what they were, or were being interpreted through the available categories of experience as tremors, as unusual weather, as the kinds of phenomena that had been occurring intermittently since the earthquake of 62 CE, and that had not, so far, proved fatal. And then, at some point in the late morning, something changed. The exact time of the initial eruption has been debated for many years, with some scholars arguing for mid-morning and others for early afternoon. The most current consensus, based on analysis of the timing of eruption phases and their correspondence with events described in Pliny's letters, suggests the eruption began around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. But whenever precisely the first shock came, the city of Pompeii was about to end. The 24th of August. The eruption begins. We are lucky, in one specific way, to have an eyewitness account of the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE. It is not the account we might wish for, because the witness was not in Pompeii, and was not experiencing the eruption from within its most destructive radius. But it is something extraordinary nonetheless, a first-hand account of a volcanic eruption written by one of the most gifted prose writers of the Roman world, preserved in letters that he sent to the historian Tacitus years after the event, at Tacitus's request. The writer is Pliny the Younger, nephew and adopted son of Pliny the Elder, who was the commander of the Roman fleet stationed at Misenum, on the far side of the Bay of Naples. Pliny the Younger was 17 years old at the time of the eruption. He was with his uncle at Misenum, which gave him a direct view across the bay to Vesuvius, though at a distance of approximately 30 kilometres. His account is vivid, precise, and clearly the product of careful memory and literary skill. He wrote it some 25 years after the events, which means it is not a contemporaneous record, but the details are consistent with what archaeological and geological investigation has subsequently revealed about the eruption. From Misenum, the first sign was a cloud. Pliny the Younger describes his uncle being summoned by a servant who had noticed something unusual above Vesuvius, a cloud of extraordinary size and shape rising from the mountain. He describes it as resembling a tree, specifically a pine, because it rose on a tall column and then spread out at the top into branches. This is a description of what volcanologists now call a Plinian eruption column, named, with appropriate irony, after Pliny the Elder himself. The column rose tens of kilometres into the atmosphere, spreading at the point where it hit the stratosphere and could rise no further, creating exactly the umbrella pine silhouette that Pliny describes. The column visible from Misenum was perhaps 20 to 30 kilometres high. It was brilliant white at first, then darker where it was loaded with ash and fragments of pumice. It was clearly visible from Misenum, 30 kilometres away, which gives you a sense of its enormous scale. For the people of Pompeii, who were much closer to its base, the sight of this column rising suddenly above the previously calm summit of Vesuvius must have been terrifying in a way that is difficult for us to imaginatively inhabit. What happened first in Pompeii was not fire, it was pumice. The eruption column, driven by the tremendous pressure of the volcanic gases that were blasting the material out of the vent, reached enormous heights and then began to shed its load of pumice clasts, the light, porous, solidified fragments of magma that had been shattered and inflated by the explosive force of the eruption. These pumice fragments rained down on Pompeii like a very heavy, unrelenting hailstorm, but instead of melting when they hit, they accumulated. They piled up on rooftops, in streets, in the impluvia of houses, on the steps of temples. The pumice fallout was not immediately fatal for most people. Individual pumice clasts, while unpleasant if they hit you, were relatively lightweight, and had been carried far enough from the eruption to have lost much of their thermal energy. They were not red hot by the time they reached Pompeii. They were warm but not burning. The danger they posed was cumulative. As they accumulated on the rooftops of buildings, the weight built up. Roman roofs were not designed to support loads of this magnitude. The flat or slightly pitched tile roofs of ordinary Pompeian houses could hold a certain amount of weight, but would eventually fail under the accumulating burden of pumice. The people of Pompeii had, in those first hours, a genuine choice. Those who recognized the danger and left the city could walk or run out of Pompeii and potentially escape to safety. The eruption column, in its initial phases, was keeping the most dangerous material in the atmosphere rather than releasing it at ground level. The ash and pumice falling on the city while alarming and damaging were not instantly lethal. There was a window of several hours in which escape was possible. Many people took this chance. The total population of Pompeii at the time of the eruption was probably in the range of 11,000 people, perhaps more, and the number of bodies recovered in the excavations, while significant, does not account for all of them. The implication is that thousands of people left Pompeii during the eruption and survived. They walked out of the city gates, some of them carrying valuables, some with nothing but what they were wearing, and they got away. We do not know where they went or what happened to them afterward. They left no record in the ruins of Pompeii because they were not in the ruins of Pompeii. They are the invisible survivors, the people whose story we cannot tell because they escaped the disaster that preserved everyone else. Pliny the Elder, watching from Misenum, decided to take his fleet and go closer. This decision was motivated partly by scientific curiosity. He was a famous naturalist and was genuinely fascinated by what he was observing, and partly by an apparent request for help from a friend who lived on the coast near the volcano. He ordered a galley prepared and set out across the bay toward Vesuvius. As he got closer, the conditions became increasingly severe. The sea was churned up by the volcanic activity. Pumice and rocks were falling from the sky. The shore was blocked by deposits from the eruption. He could not land where he had intended and eventually made for the harbour at Stabiae, south of Pompeii, where he found a friend, Pomponianus, who had his bags packed and was waiting for the wind to change so he could escape by sea. Pliny the Elder spent the night at Stabiae. His nephew's account describes him as remarkably calm, sleeping soundly while everyone around him was terrified, snoring loudly enough to be heard through the wall. Whether this was genuine equanimity, stoic philosophy in action, sheer exhaustion, or possibly a health crisis that he was managing through deliberately projected calm, we cannot know. He was in his mid-50s and not in good health. What we do know is that he did not survive. The next morning he walked down to the beach to assess the conditions for leaving by sea, and he died there. Pliny the Younger does not know the exact manner of his uncle's death. He may have been overcome by sulphurous fumes. He may have suffered a heart attack or stroke. He may have been struck by debris. The great naturalist who had spent his career studying the natural world died at the hands of its most violent manifestation. Back in Pompeii, as the afternoon of the 24th continued, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The pumice was accumulating on rooftops at a rate that was threatening structural collapse. The sky was increasingly dark. The cloud from the eruption was blotting out the sun, and as evening came on, the darkness became total. Pliny the Younger, watching from Misenum across the bay, describes a darkness that he compares not to a moonless or cloudy night, but to a closed room with all the lights out. Total, disorienting, terrifying darkness in the middle of what should have been an afternoon. People in Pompeii had been lighting lamps since the pumice began falling. The streets were deep in volcanic material, ankle deep and getting deeper. Moving through the city was increasingly difficult. Buildings were groaning under the weight of the accumulation on their roofs. Some had already begun to collapse. The sounds of the eruption itself, the roaring and crashing and the constant patter of falling pumice, would have been overwhelming. The smell of sulphur, the sharp volcanic gas that accompanies eruptions, would have been pervasive. Some people took shelter in the strongest buildings they could find, cellars, stone storerooms, the ground floors of well-built houses. They tied pillows over their heads with cloth, the ancient equivalent of a hard hat, to protect themselves from the falling pumice. Pliny the Younger mentions this detail specifically, and it is both touching and heartbreaking, because it suggests that people were improvising protective measures against a danger they had no protocol for facing. They were doing what people do in a crisis, whatever seemed sensible given the resources available. Others kept moving. Some had made it out of the city hours earlier and were now some distance away. Others were still trying to leave as the evening wore on, struggling through the deep pumice in the streets, in the dark with the eruption roaring above them. The gates of the city would have been scenes of extreme congestion and desperation. Whether those trying to leave could actually navigate the pumice-blocked streets and exit the city gates is uncertain. The pumice was deep enough by evening that movement through the city would have been very difficult, and all the while, high above in the atmosphere, the eruption column was changing. The tremendous volcanic energy that had been driving the column upward was beginning to exhaust itself. The column, which had been supported by the blast of gases and material from the vent, was becoming unstable. And an unstable eruption column does something very specific and very terrible. It collapses. The night of fire, pyroclastic flows in the final hours. The collapse of the eruptive column changed everything. Everything. In the hours when the column had been standing, the material it was ejecting was going up into the atmosphere and coming down gradually as ash and pumice, over a wide area. The people sheltering in the stronger buildings of Pompeii, uncomfortable and frightened but alive, were dealing with the secondary effects of the eruption. When the column collapsed, they were suddenly dealing with its full force, concentrated and directed at the ground. A pyroclastic flow is one of the most deadly phenomena in the natural world. When a volcanic eruption column collapses, the material that had been ascending suddenly descends, but it does not fall straight down. It spreads outward from the base of the former column in all directions as a dense, superheated mixture of gas, ash and rock fragments that moves at extraordinary speed. Speeds of several hundred kilometers per hour have been recorded in modern pyroclastic flows. The temperature of the material is typically somewhere between 200 and 700 degrees Celsius. Nothing in the path of a pyroclastic surge can survive it. There were multiple pyroclastic flows from the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE. The geological evidence, examined in detail by modern volcanologists including the team led by Haraldur Sigurdsson in the 1980s, shows at least 6 separate pyroclastic events during the course of the eruption, some primarily affecting Herculaneum, the city to the west of Vesuvius that was also buried, and some affecting Pompeii. The surges that struck Pompeii did so in the early morning hours of the 25th of August, after a night during which the city had been subjected to continuous pumice fall. The evidence for the timing and nature of the pyroclastic events at Pompeii comes from the stratigraphic analysis of the volcanic deposits, from the positions of bodies and the nature of their preservation, and from the testimony of Pliny the Younger, who experienced the outer effects of the surges from Misenum and records the extreme darkness, the ground shaking, and the terrifying conditions on the Bay of Naples on the morning of the 25th. The casts of the dead at Pompeii are the most direct and emotionally devastating evidence for what the pyroclastic surges did. The technique for making these casts was developed by Giuseppe Fiorelli, the director of the Pompeii excavations in the 1860s, and it is both simple and profound in its results. When the pyroclastic material that killed and buried the people of Pompeii solidified around their bodies, it formed a shell. Over the following centuries, the organic material of the bodies decomposed and disappeared, leaving cavities in the exact shape of each person at the moment of their death. Fiorelli realized that by injecting plaster of Paris into these cavities, he could produce a 3-dimensional record of each victim. The resulting casts are extraordinarily detailed. The musculature of limbs, the folds of clothing, the features of faces, even in some cases the expressions visible in the set of the jaw and the tension of the body, all preserved in plaster. The casts show people in attitudes that speak directly of the moment of death, curled up in fetal positions, hands covering faces, mouths open, arms raised. These are the postures of people who died in extreme distress and extreme heat, and looking at them is one of the most disturbing and intimate experiences that the archaeological record of the ancient world offers. The cause of death at Pompeii from the pyroclastic surges is now well understood. It was not primarily suffocation, though the volcanic gases were present. It was not primarily burning, though the temperatures were certainly extreme. The primary cause of death was thermal shock, the instantaneous and catastrophic effect of being exposed to extremely high temperatures. The bodies of the people killed by the pyroclastic surges show evidence of posture changes consistent with the cadaveric spasm that occurs when muscle proteins are denaturized by extreme heat. Death was essentially instantaneous. They would not have suffered for long. This is something I think, though, it is very small comfort when you are looking at the casts. The cast known as the Garden of the Fugitives presents one of the most emotionally overwhelming groups. In the garden of a house near the southern edge of the city, the remains of 13 people were found together, a group that had apparently sought shelter in the garden or had been making their way through it when the surge overtook them. The group includes adults and children. They are arranged in positions that suggest some of them had been moving and some had been huddled together. Looking at these casts, you cannot help but imagine the group. People who knew each other, family members probably, trying to find a way out, trying to protect each other, trying to survive. They did not. The dog from the house of Vesonius Primus is another cast that stays with you. This was a dog that was chained outside the house, possibly as a guard dog or watchdog. The chain was not long enough for the dog to escape the pumice that accumulated around it, and the animal died where it was secured, its body curling upward and backward as it tried to rise above the rising pumice level. The cast shows a dog in a contorted, desperate posture that is terrible to look at. It died because it was chained. It could not run even if its instincts told it to. In Herculaneum, the town to the west of Vesuvius that experienced the eruption from a different angle, the deaths came differently and in some ways even more vividly. Herculaneum received the full force of earlier pyroclastic surges before Pompeii did, because it was on the western side of Vesuvius, toward which the initial surges moved. The people of Herculaneum who had taken shelter in the boat sheds along the beach, where they were apparently waiting for rescue by sea, were killed by the surges while still in those shelters. Their skeletons, rather than casts, have been found in the boat sheds, many hundreds of them, in positions that reflect the sudden violence of their deaths. The analysis of the Herculaneum skeletons has provided extraordinary information about the people themselves, their diet, their health, their age, their occupational histories as evidenced by bone wear and development, and the precise nature of their deaths. One particularly striking finding was that many of the skeletal remains show evidence of the individuals having been exposed to the volcanic surge in different positions than those in which they were found, suggesting that the force of the surge may have moved the bodies slightly from their positions of death. The final hours of Pompeii, compressed into the darkness of the early morning of the 25th of August, were hours of terrible and complete destruction. The pyroclastic surges moved through the city faster than any human could run, hotter than any building could resist. Everything that was in their path died or was destroyed in seconds. The city that had been building and living and arguing and praying and cooking and loving for 6 centuries ceased to exist as a living community in a matter of minutes, and then it was over. The eruption continued for some time afterward, depositing further layers of ash and fine material over the already buried city. But the killing was done. Vesuvius had spoken in a language that needed no translation and admitted no reply. The silence that followed was absolute. Where there had been a city with 11,000 people, there was now a landscape of grey ash and pumice, barely distinguishable from the surrounding countryside except for the vague outlines of buildings buried beneath the surface. The air was thick with ash particles. The sky, which had been black with volcanic material, was beginning to lighten as the worst of the eruption passed. The Bay of Naples, which Pliny the Younger observed from Misenum, gradually became calmer. There was nothing left to save. Silence. The buried city. In the days and weeks that followed the eruption, the survivors in the surrounding region began to assess what had happened. Those who had fled Pompeii in time, those who had been elsewhere in the region when the eruption began, those who had been on the water or on the far side of the bay, all of them now faced the same reality. The city was gone. Not burned, not flooded, not destroyed by warfare and left as ruins. Gone. Buried under meters of volcanic material so completely that the outline of the streets had disappeared, and only the very tops of the tallest buildings, if anything, remained above the surface. Emperor Titus, who had succeeded his father Vespasian just weeks before the eruption, responded quickly. Titus had a strong sense of his obligations as emperor, and the destruction of Pompeii, Herculaneum and Stabiae represented a humanitarian crisis of considerable scale. He sent 2 ex-consuls to Campania to organize relief efforts. He contributed money from his own treasury. He authorized the redistribution of property left without heirs by the disaster, the properties of those who had died and left no surviving relatives to inherit. These measures were real and they helped. But they could not address the fundamental fact of the destruction. A city cannot be dug out from under meters of volcanic material with the tools available in the 1st century CE, not with any reasonable allocation of resources. Pompeii was not recoverable. It was not simply going to be cleaned up and rebuilt the way a flooded city might be restored after the waters receded. The volcanic material that covered it was meters deep, and removing it would have been an essentially impossible task for ancient technology. Some survivors and property owners did return to Pompeii in the immediate aftermath, hoping to retrieve valuables, to identify the sites of their houses, to recover what could be recovered. The evidence for this comes from the tunnels found in some of the buried buildings, narrow shafts cut through the volcanic material that suggest people digging down to reach specific locations. In some cases, these tunnels seem to have reached the upper floors of buildings and removed portable valuables. In other cases, they dug through walls from one building to another, suggesting systematic if chaotic looting of the buried city in the weeks after the eruption. This early disturbance of the site is one of the reasons that some areas of Pompeii are less well preserved than others, and why some buildings that appear to be in good condition have been stripped of their portable contents. The looters, if that is the right word, were often people with legitimate claims to the property they were trying to access. and their activity was an entirely understandable response to catastrophe. They were trying to salvage what they could from an irretrievable situation. But within a generation, Pompeii passed from living memory into something more distant. The survivors aged and died. Their children and grandchildren had not lived in Pompeii and had no personal connection to it beyond what they had been told. The city, once a real place with real people and real daily life, was becoming a story, and then an anecdote, and then a rumour. Roman authors mention the destruction of the Campanian cities, but with decreasing specificity. By the 2nd century CE, the exact location of Pompeii was already uncertain, at least to those who had not been there themselves. The volcanic plain above the buried city became farmland again, as volcanic plains always do eventually, because the soil is extraordinarily rich. Farms were established above the buried streets. Vineyards grew above the buried houses. The river Sarnus shifted in its course, as rivers will when the landscape is dramatically altered. The coastline changed. The world moved on. Pompeii became what it remained for nearly 1,500 years, a place that had existed somewhere and had been destroyed sometime, and whose precise location and nature were no longer precisely known. There were legends about a buried city, occasional discoveries of artifacts or building remains when someone dug too deep in a field. But the systematic effort to understand what had happened and where required both the intellectual framework and the practical tools that only modernity would provide. Rediscovery. The excavations begin. The first serious modern encounter with the buried city of Pompeii was, appropriately enough, an accident. In 1599, the architect Domenico Fontana was supervising the construction of a canal intended to bring water from the river Sarnus to the factories of the Torre Annunziata area, and his workers cutting through the volcanic material encountered ruins, inscriptions, and painted walls. Fontana recorded these discoveries but did not apparently recognize them for what they were. His notes mention finding remnants of buildings and inscriptions, but he did not make the connection to the buried city of Pompeii, or if he did not pursue it. The formal rediscovery came in 1748, under the patronage of King Charles III of Bourbon, who ruled Naples as part of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. Charles was a man with genuine intellectual interests and a passion for classical antiquity, and the excavations at Herculaneum that had begun under his patronage in 1738 had fired his enthusiasm for what else might be buried in the volcanic plain. When surveys suggested that another significant site might be present near the village of Civita, Charles ordered excavations to begin. The early excavations at Pompeii were not, by any rigorous standard, archaeological. They were treasure hunts. The primary objective was to find objects of beauty and value, paintings, sculptures, bronzes, mosaics, that could be removed to enrich the royal collection and eventually the National Museum that Charles would establish in Naples. The buildings in which these objects were found were secondary considerations. The context in which objects were found was barely recorded. Workers dug quickly toward promising areas, removed what was beautiful and portable, and moved on. What could not be moved was often left in situ, exposed to the elements and to less careful visitors, and suffered accordingly. The methods improved gradually over the following decades, but slowly and inconsistently. The excavations at Pompeii were managed by a series of directors with varying degrees of competence and varying attitudes toward preservation and documentation. Some were genuinely interested in understanding the site. Others were primarily interested in producing impressive objects for the royal collection. The political changes of the early 19th century, the Napoleonic Wars, the establishment of the Kingdom of Italy, all created disruptions in the management and funding of the excavations. The transformative figure in the history of Pompeii excavation was Giuseppe Fiorelli, who was appointed Director of Excavations in 1863. Fiorelli brought to the site something that had been largely absent before, a systematic approach based on the principles of what was becoming, in his time, a genuinely scientific archaeology. He divided the city into regions and insulae, the numbered system still used today to identify buildings and locations at Pompeii. He required that detailed records be kept of everything found and where it was found. He insisted on excavating entire buildings rather than simply opening trenches to reach individual objects. And he developed the plaster cast technique that allowed the shapes of the bodies and of other organic material like wooden furniture and plant roots to be preserved. Fiorelli's cast technique was a genuine innovation, and it changed how the world understood Pompeii. Before the casts, the human tragedy of the eruption was known in the abstract. People knew that people had died, but the casts made it immediate and visceral in a completely new way. When the first casts were produced and displayed, they caused a sensation. Photographs of the casts circulated widely. They appeared in newspapers and illustrated magazines. They were discussed in scientific journals and in popular literature. The people of Pompeii, dead for nearly 18 centuries, suddenly had faces and bodies and postures and something very like expressions. The development of proper archaeological science in the late 19th and 20th centuries continued to transform the excavation of Pompeii. New techniques for analysing biological material, chemical analysis of pigments, dendrochronology applied to preserved wood, isotope analysis of human and animal bones, all contributed to a richer and more detailed understanding of the site. The analysis of the volcanic deposits themselves, carried out systematically from the 1970s onward, allowed the sequence of events during the eruption to be reconstructed with a precision that was not previously possible. The political history of the excavations is also significant. The fascist government of Benito Mussolini sponsored large-scale excavations at Pompeii in the 1930s for political reasons, using the site as a demonstration of Italian national heritage and classical civilization. These excavations opened up large areas of the city that had not previously been accessible, but they were conducted with a speed and a lack of methodological rigour that compromised the scientific value of some of the discoveries. Objects were removed without adequate recording, contexts were disturbed, and some important evidence was irretrievably lost. The post-war period saw a gradual transition to more conservation-minded and scientifically rigorous approaches, driven partly by the growing recognition that Pompeii was not an inexhaustible resource, and that the visible ruins were deteriorating at an alarming rate. Exposed to rain, sun, frost, tourists, and the general processes of decay, the buildings and paintings of Pompeii were suffering damage that threatened to destroy what the volcano had so remarkably preserved. What was found in the excavations is, of course, the substance of everything else we have been discussing tonight. The houses, the streets, the shops, the bodies, the art, the inscriptions, all of it came to light through the process of excavation, and the story of the excavations is inseparable from the story of how we understand the city. Every chapter of what we know about Pompeii is built on the physical record recovered by the diggers who have worked this site for nearly 3 centuries. What Pompeii taught the world, the birth of archaeology, and the Pompeii effect. The rediscovery of Pompeii was not merely an archaeological event. It was a cultural earthquake, if you will forgive the geological metaphor in the circumstances, that sent shockwaves across European art, architecture, literature, and intellectual life for generations. The 18th century was the age of enlightenment and the age of classical revival, when educated Europeans were deeply invested in the idea of ancient Rome as the model of civilization and the source of cultural authority. Pompeii arrived at exactly the moment when this investment was at its most intense, and what it provided was something that classical scholarship had never previously had. Not texts, not theories, not the filtered accounts of ancient authors, but the thing itself. The impact on the visual arts was immediate and enormous. The paintings and decorative objects recovered from Pompeii and Herculaneum circulated across Europe in the form of engravings and published plates, collected in elaborate volumes that were eagerly purchased by aristocrats, artists, and architects. The visual vocabulary of Roman interior decoration, the characteristic Pompeian red, the delicate architectural ornament of the 3rd and 4th styles, the mythological panel paintings, all of these entered the mainstream of European design with extraordinary speed. The neoclassical movement in architecture and decorative arts, which was already underway in the mid-18th century, was transformed and intensified by the Pompeii discoveries. The architect Robert Adam, working in Britain from the 1760s onward, was directly influenced by the wall paintings and interior decoration of Pompeii and Herculaneum. His interiors for great English country houses and urban townhouses adopted Pompeian colours, Pompeian decorative motifs, and the Pompeian integration of painting and architecture into a unified decorative scheme. Adam's work influenced an entire generation of British architects and their clients. In France, the Pompeii influence shaped the empire style of the Napoleonic period and remained a constant reference point for decorative artists throughout the 19th century. Pompeian red was a fashionable colour for dining rooms. Pompeian motifs appeared on furniture, textiles, ceramics, and silverware. The style travelled across Europe and to North America, where federal-style interiors in the early Republic showed the influence of the classical revival that Pompeii had done so much to catalyse. literature was equally affected. The most famous literary response to Pompeii was Edward Bulwer Lytton's novel The Last Days of Pompeii, published in 1834. Bulwer Lytton was an enormously popular writer in his day, and his novel, which followed the lives of various characters in Pompeii in the weeks leading up to the eruption, and culminated in a vivid account of the disaster itself, became one of the most widely read novels of the 19th century. It was translated into multiple languages, dramatized for the stage, and later adapted for film multiple times. It shaped the popular image of Pompeii for generations, presenting the city as a place of luxury, vice, and eventual divine judgment. Whether you agree with Bulwer Lytton's moral framework or not, and most modern readers do not, the novel did something important. It made Pompeii available to a mass audience that had no access to scholarly publications or museum collections. It gave the buried city a human face, or rather a set of human faces, fictional ones but human nonetheless, and it invited millions of readers to imagine themselves in that vanished world. The impulse behind the novel is not so different from the impulse behind what we're doing tonight. Opera also engaged with Pompeii. Giovanni Puccini's opera, Pompeii's Last Day, premiered in 1825, was one of the first in a long line of musical treatments of the Pompeii story. The combination of a known historical catastrophe, a setting of exotic classical antiquity, and the possibilities for dramatic spectacle in depicting the eruption itself made the story irresistible to opera composers and their audiences. The Last Days of Pompeii became something of a set piece for European popular culture throughout the 19th century, appearing in paintings, theatrical spectacles, and eventually in the early cinema. The Pompeii effect on fashion and interior design was persistent and surprisingly specific. The colour known as Pompeian red, a deep, warm terracotta red that appears extensively in Pompeian wall painting, became fashionable throughout the 19th century and has returned to fashion multiple times since. The geometric and floral decorative motifs of Pompeian painting appear and reappear in European and American decorative arts with a regularity that suggests the deep cultural roots that the discoveries had established. But perhaps the most important contribution of Pompeii to modern intellectual life was its role in the development of archaeology as a discipline. The Pompeii excavations, precisely because they involved such a wealth of material in such excellent preservation, forced the people engaged in them to think more systematically about what they were doing and why. The gradual development of better recording methods, better conservation practices, and better analytical techniques was driven in part by the specific demands of Pompeii, which offered so much more than a typical ancient site that it required new methods to comprehend it. Fiorelli's systematic approach in the 1860s was genuinely influential beyond Pompeii. His numbered system for recording find locations, his insistence on excavating complete buildings rather than individual objects, his development of the plaster cast technique, all of these became models for excavators working elsewhere in the ancient world. Pompeii was, in a very real sense, one of the training grounds for the discipline of archaeology, as we now understand it. The people of Pompeii, faces, names, and stories. We have been talking about Pompeii for several hours now, and through all of this talking I want to make sure we do not lose sight of the most important thing about the city, that it was full of people, real people who had names and histories and ambitions and fears and relationships and ordinary Tuesday afternoons. The archaeological record of Pompeii is uniquely rich in evidence for the lives of these individuals, and spending some time with specific people and specific stories is, I think, the most important thing we can do before we close this long evening's conversation. Eumachia is someone we have already met briefly, in the context of the forum building that bore her name. Let us spend a little more time with her, because she is one of the most remarkable individuals we can identify in Pompeii. Her full name was Eumachia, and she was a member of one of Pompeii's prosperous families, the daughter of a man named Lucius Eumachius, who had made his fortune in the manufacture and sale of pottery, particularly amphorae for the transport of wine and garum. She was a priestess of Venus, the city's patron goddess, a role that conferred genuine social prestige and public visibility. The building she donated to the city, in her own name and in the name of her son Marcus Numistrius Fronto, was enormous and elaborately decorated. The facade bore her inscription in large letters. A secondary inscription inside the building, placed there apparently by the woolworkers and fullers whose guild used the building, praised her generosity in terms that make clear the political weight that her benefaction carried. Eumachia could not vote and could not hold formal public office, but she could donate a major public building, have her name on its facade, receive public honor from the city's professional guilds, and exercise real influence over public life through her wealth and her religious role. Her statue stood in a niche inside the building she had donated, and the base of that statue has been recovered. She was a woman of consequence in her city, and she knew it, and the city acknowledged it. The family of Lucius Caecilius Jucundus is known to us through a remarkable archive of wooden writing tablets discovered in the 1850s in the back rooms of his house, which stands on a quiet street not far from the Forum. Jucundus was a banker, or rather what the Romans called an argentarius, a man who conducted financial transactions on behalf of others, handling sales, receipts, and financial instruments. His archive contains the records of over 150 individual financial transactions dating from the 53rd to the 62nd CE, a period that ends with the earthquake that presumably disrupted his business considerably. The tablets record sales of property and goods, with Jucundus acting as the intermediary. Each tablet records the names of the parties, the amount involved, the date, and the signatures of witnesses. Reading through these records, you encounter the commercial life of Pompeii in extraordinary specificity. Property sales, the sale of mules, receipts for the rental of public facilities, payments for goods. The people named in these documents are real people, members of the commercial middle class of Pompeii, whose names appear nowhere else in the historical record, but who were clearly important participants in the economic life of their city. Jucundus himself appears in these records as a methodical and successful businessman. His house, which is comfortable but not grand, reflects the prosperous commercial class rather than the great aristocratic elite. The portrait Herm found in his house, a small bust-length portrait probably of his father, shows us a face, a real face, jug-eared and somewhat amused-looking with a wart on his left cheek that the sculptor has faithfully recorded. This is not a flattering idealized portrait in the Greek mode. This is a real person, wart and all, commemorated with Roman directness. The gladiators of Pompeii are another group who leave us with traces of real individual lives. The gladiatorial barracks at Pompeii, a large building near the large theatre, was still in use, or being converted to use, at the time of the eruption. In the rooms of this building, archaeologists found the remains of over 60 individuals, including not only gladiators but also what appear to be women and children, raising interesting questions about who was living in the barracks and under what circumstances. Among the bodies was one wearing extremely fine gold jewellery, a woman of apparent high status whose presence in the gladiatorial barracks has been the subject of considerable scholarly speculation. The inscriptions and graffiti related to gladiators from Pompeii give us names and reputations. Celadus, the net fighter, is described in one graffito as the glory of the girls and the sighing of the girls. Another gladiator, Felix, is noted as having killed 4 opponents and having been set free. A man named Albinus is described as a gladiator of the fleet, suggesting naval combat connections. These names and epithets give us the outline of careers in a profession that was simultaneously despised and celebrated in Roman culture. A profession where fame was real and mortality was constant. The wax tablets found in various houses throughout Pompeii are among the richest sources of personal and social information we have. Beyond the Jucundus archive, similar records have been found in other contexts, giving us glimpses of business transactions, legal documents, personal correspondence, and administrative records. From these texts, we can reconstruct in part the economic and social relationships within which individual Pompeians lived their lives. We can see who owed money to whom. We can see which families were connected through marriage and business. We can see something of the complex web of obligation and reciprocity that structured social life in a Roman city. The enslaved people of Pompeii are a group whose individual lives are hardest to reconstruct, because enslavement tends to erase individual identity from the documentary record. But traces remain. Names of enslaved individuals appear in the financial records, in graffiti, in legal documents relating to the management of property. Occasionally, an enslaved person appears more fully in the record when they were freed and their freedom was documented, or when they went on after freedom to achieve some form of social prominence. The walls of Pompeii are covered with graffiti, and the graffiti is one of the richest and most democratically distributed sources of information about the individuals who lived in the city. Unlike the formal inscriptions, which were commissioned and controlled by wealthy patrons, the graffiti was produced by everyone, by schoolboys practicing their letters, by adults recording romantic attachments, by bar patrons commenting on the quality of the wine, by political supporters naming their preferred candidates, by someone who was bored and had a sharp instrument and a blank piece of wall. One of my favourite pieces of Pompeian graffiti, and I have several favourites which is perhaps indicative of the kind of person I am, is the inscription found on a wall that reads in Latin, "I am amazed, O wall, that you have not fallen down, since you support the tedious writings of so many writers. This is 2,000 years old. It is still funny." Whoever wrote it was a person who looked at the wall next to them covered in other people's graffiti and thought, "I am going to write a joke on this wall about how much graffiti is on this wall." That person and I would have gotten along. The children of Pompeii left their traces too in ways that are particularly affecting. Small handprints preserved in plaster, graffiti of animals and figures scratched at child height on the lower parts of walls, toys found in houses and in the ruins, small figurines, a wheeled toy dog, glass and clay marbles, a miniature set of bronze dishes. The evidence of childhood is everywhere in Pompeii, as it would be in any living community, and it is one of the most powerful reminders that this was not a museum. It was a home. The people of Pompeii were not heroic or villainous or particularly remarkable by the standards of their time. They were not, most of them, the stuff of history books. They were shopkeepers and lawyers and priests and freedmen and slaves and children and old women and gladiators and bakers and sailors and politicians and lovers and grieving parents and proud parents, and people who were bored and people who were happy and people who had no idea what was coming. They were people. That is the most important thing about them, that they were people. And that is the most important thing about Pompeii, that it was their city, and for nearly 2,000 years after they were gone, it kept saying their names. The legacy of Pompeii, frozen, remembered, and still speaking. Pompeii today is one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world, receiving somewhere between 2 and 3 million visitors each year in normal times. People come from every country on Earth to walk through its streets and stand in its forum and look at its frescoes and pay their respect at the casts of its dead. It has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1997. It is managed by a special administrative body, the Parco Archaeologico di Pompeii, which is responsible for both the ongoing excavation and the conservation of what has already been excavated. Conservation is, frankly, one of the most pressing and difficult challenges facing Pompeii today. The volcanic material that buried the city preserved it for nearly 2,000 years. But once that material is removed and the buildings and paintings are exposed to the air, they begin to deteriorate. Rain damages the frescoes. Frost cycles crack the masonry. Tourists inadvertently cause damage simply by the presence of many thousands of people moving through a fragile space every day. Plants grow in the ruins and their roots break through walls. The slow processes of decay that were halted by the eruption have resumed, and they have nearly 2 millennia of catching up to do. The 20th century was, in some respects, unkind to Pompeii. The Mussolini-era excavations opened up large areas without adequate provision for their subsequent protection. Buildings that were well preserved under the ground were exposed to the elements and began to deteriorate. Second World War bombing damaged parts of the site. Poorly managed tourism in the post-war decades caused additional harm. By the early 21st century, parts of Pompeii were in a state of significant disrepair, and there was genuine international concern about the condition of the site. The response to this concern was the Great Pompeii Project, a major European Union-funded initiative launched in 2012 and running through the present decade, which has allocated significant resources to the restoration and conservation of the most at-risk structures. The results have been impressive. Buildings that were leaning, crumbling, or losing their plaster decoration have been stabilized, repaired, and in some cases beautifully restored. New drainage systems have been installed to reduce water damage. Conservation techniques have improved markedly. The site is in significantly better condition today than it was 20 years ago, and the trend is positive. New excavations continue to produce extraordinary results. The Regio 5 excavations, which began in earnest around 2018 and are still ongoing, have revealed new houses, new paintings, new graffiti, new human remains, and new evidence about the lives of the people of Pompeii. Among the most remarkable recent discoveries is a fresco showing what appears to be a precursor of the modern pizza, a round flatbread topped with various ingredients depicted on a silver tray. The Romans did not have tomatoes, which were unknown in Europe until the 16th century, so it was not pizza in the modern sense. But the image is close enough to generate enormous media coverage, which tells us something about both the enduring appeal of Pompeii and about what people in the 21st century find exciting about antiquity. The application of modern technology to the study of Pompeii has opened new possibilities that would have seemed like science fiction to earlier excavators. Multispectral imaging can reveal inscriptions and painted details invisible to the naked eye. Three-dimensional scanning creates precise digital models of buildings and objects that can be studied and shared globally. Isotope analysis of human and animal remains provides information about diet, origin, and health that no amount of visual inspection could reveal. Soil micromorphology, the analysis of soil samples at microscopic scale, reveals information about ancient agricultural practices, diet, and environmental conditions. The city that was buried in 79 CE is still giving up its secrets, and the tools for receiving those secrets keep improving. Virtual and digital reconstructions of Pompeii have made it possible for people who cannot visit the physical site to experience something of what the city looked like in its prime. Photorealistic computer-generated reconstructions show the streets with their bright painted buildings, the forum with its colonnade and its statues, the houses with their colourful frescoes. These reconstructions are not perfect, and they involve interpretive choices that scholars debate. But they serve an important purpose in making the city accessible and comprehensible to people who might otherwise experience it only as grey ruins. They give colour and life back to a city that had both, and that deserves to have them back. What does Pompeii still have to teach us? The honest answer is, quite a lot. The ongoing excavations keep producing new evidence. New analytical techniques keep revealing new information from material that has been in museum collections for decades. The vast body of inscriptions from Pompeii, including the graffiti, is still being fully analysed and published for the first time through projects like the Ancient Graffiti Project, which is creating a comprehensive digital database of inscriptions from the Roman world. The economic, social and cultural history of Roman Italy is being rewritten in part on the basis of evidence from Pompeii. But beyond the specific historical and archaeological contributions, Pompeii teaches something more general and more important. It teaches us what it means for a human community to exist in time. The people of Pompeii built their city over centuries, layer upon layer, generation after generation, each generation inheriting something from the past and adding something for the future. They built their houses and decorated their walls and conducted their business, and educated their children and buried their dead and argued about politics, and worshipped their gods in exactly the way that human beings have always done these things. They did not know they were building a time capsule. They were just living. The disaster that preserved Pompeii was also the disaster that ended it, and this paradox is at the heart of what makes the city so powerful as an historical and human document. We know about Pompeii because it was destroyed. We feel so close to its people because they were frozen at a specific moment and have not changed since. The bread in the oven and the food on the table and the dog chained to the wall and the electoral notices freshly painted on the walls all speak of a specific Tuesday in August that never became Wednesday. There is a line from the Roman poet Horace that I keep thinking about when I think about Pompeii. Horace wrote, "And I am going to give you the spirit of it rather than a strict translation, that bronze monuments wear away, the pyramids crumble, but the right words will outlast the eating of time." He was talking about poetry. But the people of Pompeii made their own kind of monument, not in words or in bronze, but in the ordinary material of daily life, in the plaster of their walls, and the stone of their streets, and the ash that covered everything and preserved it. And that monument has outlasted almost everything. It has outlasted the Roman Empire that governed them. It has outlasted the languages that superseded Latin. It has outlasted, so far, nearly 2,000 years of the world's enthusiastic efforts to wear everything down. Pompeii remains, the streets remain, the houses remain, the paintings remain, the people remain, in their casts and their bones and their names scratched into walls and their bread left in ovens on a Tuesday morning in August of 79. They remain, and they have things to say, and if we are patient and quiet and attentive enough, we can still hear them. And so we come to the end of tonight's long journey. We have walked through the streets of Pompeii from their earliest beginnings in the hands of the Oscans through the Greek and Etruscan influences that shaped them, through the Samnite prosperity that built their first great houses, through the Roman transformation that gave them their final form. We have stood in the Forum and the baths and the amphitheatre and the temples. We have eaten at the Thermopylae and drunk at the bars and stood in front of paintings that are as vivid now as they were the morning before the volcano spoke. We have met Eumacia and Eucundus and the gladiator Celadus and the unnamed baker who put bread in the oven and never took it out. We have stood at the edge of the Garden of the Fugitives and acknowledged what happened there. We We have followed the story through 15 centuries of burial and forgetting and rediscovery and argument and scholarship and care. And now it is late. Or early, depending on which end of the night you're at. The city is quiet now. It has been quiet for a very long time, in the literal sense. But it is not silent. It never was silent. Not really. Not to people who are willing to listen carefully. The stones speak. The walls speak. The casts speak, in the only language left to them, which is the language of form and posture and the physical record of a specific moment in time. They are all saying the same thing, more or less. We were here. This was real. This mattered. Let that thought settle as you drift towards sleep. The idea that somewhere under the Italian sun, in a city by the sea at the foot of a quiet-looking mountain, the ordinary daily life of the ancient world is preserved in extraordinary detail, waiting patiently for the next person who is curious enough to look. The bread is still in the oven, the wine is still in the jar, the dog is still chained to the wall, in plaster now, in a museum in Naples, forever trying to rise above the ash that covered everything. And somewhere in that ash, in the deep volcanic layers that gave and took and preserved and destroyed, the city of Pompeii is still, in some sense that goes beyond mere archaeology, still there, still waiting, still speaking, still, after everything, magnificently, stubbornly, beautifully alive. Sleep well. And if you dream of a city by a blue bay, with painted walls and noisy streets and bread baking in the morning, and the smell of garum on the wind and Vesuvius rising green and quiet and seemingly benevolent above it all. Dream of the people who lived there and did not know they were making history. Dream of the ordinary Tuesday afternoon that became, against all their wishes and all their plans, eternal. Good night.